Chapter 17 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. Chapter 17, St. Bartholomew's Day. "Kill, kill, kill!" was the cry in Paris. "Blood, blood, death to the Huguenots!" came from the lips of thousands of maddened murderers. Blood flowed everywhere, men dabbled in blood, almost bathed in blood. A crimson tide flowed in the streets of Paris, deep enough to damn the infamous Catherine de Medici and her confederates. To the crime of assassination, on that direful day of St. Bartholomew, must be added that of treachery of the darkest hue. Peace had been made between the warring parties. The Protestant chiefs had been invited to Paris to witness the marriage of the young King Henry of Navarre with Marguerite de Valois, sister of the King of France, which was fixed for the 18th of August, 1572. They had been received with every show of amity and goodwill. The great Huguenot leader, Admiral de Coligny, had come confiding in the honour of his late foes, and had been received by the King, Charles IX., with demonstrations of sincere friendship, though the weak monarch warned him to beware of the Guises, his bitter enemies, and the remorseless haters of all opponents of the Catholic party. On the 22nd of August the work of treachery began. On that day a murderous shot was fired at Coligny as he stood by the window of his room engaged in reading a letter. It smashed 2 fingers of his right hand and lodged a ball in his left arm. The would-be murderer escaped. "Here is a fine proof of the fidelity to his agreement of the Duke of Guise," said Coligny reproachfully to the king. "My dear father," returned the king, "the hurt is yours, the grief and outrage mine, but I will take such vengeance that it shall never be forgotten." He meant it, for the moment, but his mind was feeble, his will weak, himself a mere puppet in the hands of his imperious mother and the implacable Guises. Between them they had determined to rid themselves of the opposing party in the state on the death of the admiral and the other Protestant leaders. Sure of their power over the king, the orders for the massacre were already given when, near midnight of August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, the queen, with some of her leading counsellors, sought the king's room and made a determined assault upon the feeble defences of his intellect. The slaughter of many thousands of men may be prevented by a single sword thrust, they argued. Only kill the admiral, the head and front of the civil wars, and the strength of his party will die with him. The sacrifice of 2 or 3 men will satisfy the loyal party, who will remain for ever your faithful and obedient subjects. War is inevitable. The Guises on one side and the Huguenots on the other cannot be controlled. Better to win a battle in Paris, where you hold all the chiefs in our clutches, than to put it to hazard in the field. In this case, pity would be cruelty, and cruelty would be pity." For an hour and a half the struggle with the weak will of the king continued. He was violently agitated, but could not bring himself to order the murder of the guest to whom he had promised his royal faith and protection. The queen mother grew alarmed. Delay might ruin all by the discovery of her plans. At length, with a show of indignation, she said, "Then if you will not do this, permit me and your brother to retire to some other part of the kingdom." This threat to leave him alone to grapple with the difficulties that surrounded him frightened the feeble king. He rose hastily from his seat. "By God's death," he cried passionately, "since you think proper to kill the admiral, I consent." With these words he left the room. The beginning of the work of bloodshed had been fixed for an hour before daybreak, but the king had spoken in a moment of passion and agitation. An hour's reflection might change his mind. There was no time to be lost. The queen gave the signal at once, and out on the air of that dreadful night rang the terrible tocsin peal from the tower of the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, the alarm call for which the white-crossed murderers waited. Quickly the silence of the night was broken by loud cries, shouts of vengeance, the tramp of many feet, the sharp reports of musketry. The work was begun. Every man not marked by a cross was to be slaughtered. The voice of murder broke fearfully upon the peacefulness of the recently quiet midnight hour. The noise roused Coligny. He rose hastily and threw on his dressing-gown. The cries and shots told him what was going on. He had trusted the faithless Guises and the soulless de Medici, and this was what came of it. "Monsieur Merlin," he said to a clergyman who was with him, "say me a prayer. I commit my soul to my Saviour." Some of his gentlemen entered the room. "What is the meaning of this riot?" asked Ambroise Paré. "My lord, it is God calling us," said Cornaton. "I have long been ready to die," said the Admiral. "But you, my friends, save yourselves, if it is still possible." They left him, and escaped, the most of them by the roof. Only one man stayed with him, Nicolas Mousse, a German servant, as little concerned, says Cornaton, as if there was nothing going on around him. The flight had been made barely in time. Hasty footsteps were heard below. The assassins were in the house. In a moment more the chamber door was flung open, and 2 servants of the Duke of Guise entered. "Art not thou the Admiral?" asked one of them, Bem by name. "Young man," answered Coligny, "thou comest against a wounded and aged man. Thou'lt not shorten my life by much." Behm's answer was to plunge a heavy boar spear, which he held into the body of the defenceless veteran. Withdrawing it, he struck him on the head with it. Coligny fell, saying, "If it were but a man, but it is a horse boy." Others rushed into the room and thrust their weapons into the dying man. "Behm!" cried the Duke of Guise from the courtyard, "hast thou done?" "It is all over, my lord," answered the assassin. The murderers flung the body from the window. It fell with a crash at the feet of Guise and his companions. They turned it over, wiped the blood from the face, and said, "Faith, it is he, sure enough." Some say that Guise kicked the bleeding corpse in the face. Meanwhile, murder was everywhere. The savage lower orders of Paris, all high and low of the party of the Guises, were infected with the thirst for blood, and the streets of the city became a horrible whirlpool of slaughter, all who did not wear the saving cross being shot down without mercy or discrimination. The anecdotes of that fatal night and the succeeding day are numerous, some of them pathetic, most of them ferocious, all tending to show how brutal man may become under the inspiration of religious prejudice and the example of slaughter, the blood fury, as it has been fitly termed. Teligny, the son-in-law of Coligny, took refuge on a roof. The guards of the Duke of Anjou fired at him as at a target. La Rochefoucauld, with whom the king had been in merry chat until 11 o'clock of the preceding evening, was aroused by a loud knocking upon his door. He opened it. 6 masked men rushed in, and instantly buried their poignards in his body. The new Queen of Navarre had just gone to bed, under peremptory orders from her mother, Catherine de Medici. She was wakened from her first slumber by a man knocking and kicking at her door with wild shouts of "Navarre! Navarre!" Her nurse ran to open the door, thinking that it was the king, her lady's husband. A wounded and bleeding gentleman rushed in, blood flowing from both arms, 4 archers pursuing him into the queen's bedchamber. The fugitive flung himself on the queen's couch, seizing her in his alarm. She leaped out of the bed towards the wall, he following her, and still clasping her round the body. What it meant she knew not, but screamed in fright, her assailants screaming as loudly. Their cries had the effect of bringing into the room Monsieur de Nancey, captain of the guards, who could not help laughing on seeing the plight of the queen. But in an instant more he turned in a rage upon the archers, cursing them for their daring, and harshly bade them begone. As for the fugitive, Monsieur de Lérins by name, he granted him his life at the queen's prayer. She put him to bed in her closet, and attended him until he was well of his wounds. Such are a few of the anecdotes told of that night of terror. They might be extended indefinitely, but anecdotes of murder are not of the most attractive character, and may profitably be passed over. The king saved some, including his nurse and Ambroise Paré, his surgeon, both Huguenots. 2 others, destined in the future to play the highest parts in the kingdom, were saved by his orders. These were the 2 Huguenot princes, Henri of Navarre and Henri de Condé. The king sent for them during the height of the massacre, and bade them recant or die. "I mean for the future," he said, "to have but one religion in my kingdom, the Mass or death. Make your choice." The King of Navarre asked for time to consider the subject, reminding Charles of his promised protection. Condé was defiant. "I will remain firm in what I believe to be the true religion," he said, "though I have to give up my life for it." "Seditious madman, rebel, and son of a rebel!" cried the king furiously. "If within 3 days you do not change your language, I will have you strangled." In 3 days Charles himself changed his language. Remorse succeeded his insensate rage. "Ambrose," he said to his surgeon, "I do not know what has come over me for the last 2 or 3 days, but I feel my mind and body greatly excited, in fact, just as if I had a fever. It seems to me every moment, whether I wake or sleep, that these murdered corpses appear to me with hideous and blood-covered faces. I wish the helpless and innocent had not been included." On the next day he issued orders prohibiting on pain of death any slaying or plundering. But he had raised a fury not easily to be allayed. The tocsin of death still rang; to it the great bell of the palace added at intervals its clanging peal. Shouts, yells, the sharp reports of pistols and arquebuses, the shrieks of victims filled the air. 60,000 murderers thronged the streets, slaying all who wore not the white cross, breaking into and plundering houses, and slaughtering all within them. All through that dreadful Sunday the crimson carnival went on, death everywhere, wagons loaded with bleeding bodies traversing the streets, to cast their gory burdens into the Seine, a scene of frightful massacre prevailing, such as city streets have seldom witnessed. The king judged feebly, if he deemed that with a word he could quell the storm his voice had raised. Many of the nobles of the court, satisfied with the death of the Huguenot leaders, attempted to stay the work of death, but a report that a party of Huguenots had attempted to kill the king added to the popular fury, and the sanguinary work went on. It is not known how many were slain during that outbreak of slaughter. It was not confined to Paris, but spread through France. Thousands are said to have been killed in the city. In the kingdom the number slain has been variously estimated at from 10 to 100,000. Such was the frightful result of a lamentable event in which religious animosity was taken advantage of to intensify the political enmity of the warring parties of the realm. It proved a useless infamy. Charles IX. died 2 years afterwards, after having suffered agonies of remorse. Despite the massacre, the Huguenots were not all slain. Nor had the murder of Coligny robbed them of a leader. Henry of Navarre, who had narrowly escaped death on that fearful night, was in the coming years to lead the Protestants to many a victory, and in the end to become King of France, as Henry IV. By his coronation Coligny was revenged. The Huguenots, instead of being exterminated by the hand of massacre, had defeated their foes and raised their leader to the throne, and the Edict of Nantes, which was soon afterwards announced, gave liberty of conscience to France for many years thereafter. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. Chapter 18, King Henry of Navarre. For the first time in its history, France had a Protestant king. Henry III. had died by the knife of an assassin. Henry of Navarre was named by him as his successor, but the Catholic chiefs of France, in particular the leaders of the league which had been banded against Henry III., were bitterly opposed to the reign of a Huguenot in a realm that had always been governed by Catholic kings, and it was evident that only by the sword could the throne be secured. The league held Paris and much of France. Henry's army was too weak to face them. He fell back on Dieppe, that he might be near the coast and in position to receive reinforcements and supplies promised him by Queen Elizabeth. The Duke of Mayenne pursued him with an army of some 35,000 men. Such was the situation at the date of the opening of our story. Henry III. had been killed on the 1st of August, 1589. Henry IV. was proclaimed king on the 2nd of August. On the 26th of the same month he reached Dieppe, where he was met by the governor, Aymar de Chastes, and the leading citizens, who brought him the keys of the place. "I come to salute my lord and hand over to him the government of this city," said Aymar, who was a Catholic noble. "Ventre Saint Gris!" cried Henry with his favourite exclamation, "I know none more worthy of it than you are." The citizens crowded round the king, profuse in their expressions of loyalty. "No fuss, my lads," said Henry, who was the embodiment of plain common sense. "All I want is your affection, good bread, good wine, and good hospitable faces." Within the town he was received with loud cheers, and the population seemed enthusiastic in his favour. But the shrewd soldier had no idea of shutting himself up in a walled town, to be besieged there by Mayenne. So, After carefully inspecting his fortifications, he left 500 men within the town, assisted by a garrison of burgesses, and established his camp on a neighbouring hill, crowned by the old castle of Arques, where he put all his men, and all the peasants that could be found, busily to work digging like beavers, working night and day to fortify the camp. He set the example himself in the use of the spade. "It is a wonder I am alive with such work as I have," he wrote at the time. "God have pity upon me and show me mercy, blessing my labours, as he does in spite of many folks. I am well, and my affairs are going well. I have taken Eu. The enemy, who are double me just now, thought to catch me there, but I drew off towards Dieppe, and I await them in a camp that I am fortifying. To-morrow will be the day when I shall see them, and I hope, with God's help, that if they attack me they will find they have made a bad bargain." The enemy came, as Henry had said, saw his preparations, and by a skilful manoeuvre sought to render them useless. Mayenne had no fancy for attacking those strong works in front. He managed, by an unlooked-for movement, to push himself between the camp and the town, hoping to cut off the king's communication with the sea, divide his forces, deprive him of his reinforcements from England, and finally surround him and capture him, as he had promised the Leaguers of Paris, who were already talking of the iron cage in which the Béarnais would be sent to them. But Henry IV. was not the man to be caught easily in a trap. Much as had been his labour at digging, he at once changed his plans, and decided that it would not pay him to await the foe in his entrenchments. If they would not come to him, he must go to them, preserving his communications at any cost. Chance, rather than design, brought the two armies into contact. A body of light horse approached the king's entrenchments. A sharp skirmish followed. "My son," said Marshal de Biron to the young Count of Auvergne, "charge, now is the time." The young soldier, a prince by birth, obeyed, and so effectively that he put the Leaguers to rout, killed 300 of them, and returned to camp unobstructed. On the succeeding 2 days similar encounters took place, with like good fortune for Henry's army. Mayenne was annoyed. His prestige was in danger of being lost. He determined to recover it by attacking the entrenchments of the king with his whole army. The night of the 20th of September came. It was a very dark one. Henry, having reason to expect an attack, kept awake the whole night. In company with a group of his officers, he gazed over the dark valley within which lay Mayenne's army. The silence was profound. Afar off could be seen a long line of lights, so flickering and inconstant that the observers were puzzled to decide if they were men or glow-worms. At 5 in the morning Henry gave orders that every man should be at his post. He had his breakfast brought to him on the field, and ate it with a hearty appetite, seated in a fosse with his officers around him. While there, a prisoner was brought in who had been taken during the reconnaissance. "Good morning, Belin," said the king, who knew him. "Embrace me for your welcome appearance." Belin did so, taking the situation philosophically. "To give you appetite for dinner," he said, "you are about to have work to do with 30,000 foot and 10,000 horse. Where are your forces?" he continued, looking around curiously. "You don't see them all, Monsieur de Belin," answered Henry. "You don't reckon the good God and the good right, but they are ever with me." Belin had told the truth. About 10 o'clock Mayenne made his attack. It was a day ill-suited for battle, for there lay upon the field so thick a fog that the advancing lines could not see each other at 10 paces apart. Despite this, the battle proceeded briskly, and for nearly 3 hours the two armies struggled, now one, now the other in the ascendant. Henry fought as vigorously as any of his men, all being so confusedly mingled in the fog that there was little distinction between officers and soldiers. At one time he found himself so entangled in a medley of disorganized troopers that he loudly shouted, "Courage, gentlemen, pray, courage! Are there not among you 50 gentlemen willing to die with their king?" The confusion was somewhat alleviated by the arrival, at this juncture, of 500 men from Dieppe, whose opportune coming the king gladly greeted. Springing from his horse, he placed himself beside Chatillon, their leader, to fight in the trenches. The battle, which had been hot at this point, now grew furious, and for some 15 minutes there was a hand-to-hand struggle in the fog, like that of two armies fighting in the dead of night. Then came a welcome change. For what followed we may quote Sully. "When things were in this desperate state," he says, "the fog, which had been very thick all the morning, dropped down suddenly, and the cannon of the castle of Arques, getting sight of the enemy's army, A volley of 4 pieces was fired, which made 4 beautiful lanes in their squadrons and battalions. That pulled them up quite short, and 3 or 4 volleys in succession, which produced marvellous effects, made them waver, and little by little retire all of them behind the turn of the valley, out of cannon shot, and finally to their quarters. Mayenne was defeated. The king held the field. He pursued the enemy for some distance, and then returned to Arques to return thanks to God for the victory. Immediately afterwards, Mayenne struck camp and marched away, leaving Henry master of the situation. The King of Navarre had scored a master point in the contest for the throne of France. During the ensuing year the cause of the king rapidly advanced. More and more of France acknowledged him as the legitimate heir to the throne. A year after the affair at Dieppe, he marched suddenly and rapidly on Paris, and would have taken it had not Mayenne succeeded in throwing his army into the city when it was half captured. In March, 1590, the two armies met again on the plain of Ivry, a village halfway between Mantes and Dreux, and here was fought one of the famous battles of history, a conflict whose final result was to make Henry IV. King of all France. On this notable field the king was greatly outnumbered. Mayenne had under his command about 4,000 horse and 20,000 foot, while Henry's force consisted of 3,000 horse and 8,000 foot. But the king's men were much better disciplined, and much more largely moved by patriotism, Mayenne's army being in considerable part made up of German and Swiss auxiliaries. The king's men, Catholics and Protestants alike, were stirred by a strong religious enthusiasm. In a grave and earnest speech to his men, Henry placed the issue of the day in the hands of the Almighty. The Catholics of his army crowded to the neighbouring churches to hear mass. The Huguenots, much fewer in number, also made their prayers after their sort. The day of battle dawned, March 14th, 1590. Henry's army was drawn up with the infantry to right and left, partly made up of German and Swiss auxiliaries, the cavalry under his own command in the centre. In this arm, in those days of tradition between ancient and modern war, the strength of armies lay, and those 5 lines of horsemen were that day to decide the fate of the field. In the early morning Henry displayed a winning instance of that generous good feeling for which he was noted. Count Schomberg, colonel of the German auxiliaries, had some days before asked for the pay of his troops, saying that they would not fight if not paid. Henry, indignant at this implied threat, had harshly replied, "People do not ask for money on the eve of a battle." He now, just as the battle was about to begin, approached Schomberg with a look of contrition on his face. "Colonel," he said, "I have hurt your feelings. This may be the last day of my life. I cannot bear to take away the honour of a brave and honest gentleman like you. Pray forgive me, and embrace me." "Sir," answered Schomberg, with deep feeling, "the other day your Majesty wounded me. To-day you kill me." He gave up the command of the German reiters, that he might fight in the king's own squadron, and was killed in the battle. As the two armies stood face to face, waiting for the signal of onset, Henry rode along the front of his squadron and halted opposite their centre. "Fellow soldiers," he said, "you are Frenchmen. Behold the enemy. If to-day you run my risks, I also run yours. I will conquer or die with you. Keep your ranks well, I pray you. If the heat of battle disperse you for a while, rally as soon as you can under those pear trees you see up yonder to my right, and if you lose sight of your standards, do not lose sight of my white plume. Make that your rallying point, for you will always find it in the path of honour, and, I hope, of victory also." And Henry pointed significantly to the snow-white plume that ornamented his helmet, while a shout of enthusiastic applause broke from all those who had heard his stirring appeal. Those words have become famous. The white plume of Henry of Navarre is still one of the rallying points of history. It has also a notable place in poetry, in Macaulay's stirring Ode of Ivry, from which we quote: "And if my standard-bearer fall, as fall full well he may, For never saw I promise yet of such a bloody fray, Press where ye see my white plume shine amidst the ranks of war, And be your oriflamme to-day the helmet of Navarre." The words we have quoted spoken, Henry galloped along with the whole line of his army, then halted again, threw his bridle over his arm, and said, with clasped hands and deep feeling: "O God, thou knowest my thoughts, and dost see to the very bottom of my heart. If it be for my people's good that I keep the crown, favour thou my cause, and uphold my arms. But if thy holy will have otherwise ordained, At least let me die, O God, in the midst of these brave soldiers who give their lives for me." The infantry began the battle. Egmont, in command of Mayenne's right wing, attacked sharply, but after a brief success was killed and his men repulsed. On the king's right, Aumont, Biron, and Montpensier drove their opponents before them. At this stage of the affray, Mayenne, in command of the powerful body of cavalry in the centre, fell upon the king's horse with a furious charge, which for the time threatened to carry all before it. The lines wavered and broke. Knights and nobles fell back. Confusion began, and was increasing. The odds appeared too great. For a brief and perilous period the battle seemed lost. At this critical moment Henry came to the rescue. Victory or death had been his word to his men. His promise was now to be kept in deeds. Pointing with his sword to the enemy, and calling in a loud voice upon all who heard him to follow, he spurred fiercely forward, and in a moment his white plume was seen waving in the thickest ranks of the foe. His cry had touched the right places in the hearts of his followers. Forgetting every thought but that of victory and the rescue of their beloved leader, they pushed after him in a gallant and irresistible charge, which resembled in its impetuosity that of the Black Prince at Poitiers. Mayenne's thronging horsemen wavered and broke before this impetuous rush. Into the heart of the opposing army rode Henry and his ardent followers, cutting, slashing, shouting in victorious enthusiasm. In a few minutes the forward movement of Mayenne's cavalry was checked. His troops halted, wavered, broke, and fled, hotly pursued by their foes. The battle was won. That rush of the white plume had carried all before it, and swept the serried ranks of the Leaguers to the wind. Let us quote the poetic rendition of this scene from Macaulay's Ode: "Hurrah! the foes are moving! Hark to the mingled din of fife and steed and trump and drum and roaring culverin! The fiery Duke is pricking fast across St. André's plain, with all the hireling cavalry of Gueldre and Almaine. Now, by the lips of those ye love, fair gentlemen of France, charge for the golden lilies upon them with the lance. 1,000 spurs are striking deep, 1,000 spears in rest, 1,000 knights are pressing close behind a snow-white crest, and in they burst and on they rushed, while, like a gliding star, amidst the thickest carnage blazed the helmet of Navarre." The enemy's cavalry being in flight and hotly pursued, Henry, with a handful of horsemen—he had but 30 at his back when he came out of the mêlée—charged upon the Walloons and Swiss, who instantly broke and fled with such impetuous haste that they left their standards behind them. "Slay the strangers, but spare the French," was the king's order, as a hot pursuit of the flying infantry began, in which the German auxiliaries in particular were cut down mercilessly. And then we thought on vengeance, and all along our van "Remember Saint Bartholomew" was passed from man to man. But outspake gentle Henry, "No Frenchman is my foe. Down, down with every foreigner, but let your brethren go." The Swiss, however, ancient friends and allies of France, begged the king's compassion, and were admitted to mercy, being drafted into his service. The flying Germans and French were severely punished, great numbers of them falling, many more being taken, the list of prisoners including a large number of lords and leaders of the foe. The battle had been remarkably short. It was won by the cavalry, the infantry having scarcely come into action. As to its effect, we may quote again from the poem: "Now glory to the Lord of hosts, from whom all glories are, and glory to our sovereign liege, King Henry of Navarre. Now let there be the merry sound of music and of dance Through thy cornfields green and sunny vines, O pleasant land of France. Hurrah! hurrah! a single field hath turned the chance of war. Hurrah! hurrah! for Ivry and Henry of Navarre." It turned the chance of war, in truth, in a great measure. Paris was in consternation. Everywhere was a great change in public opinion. Men ceased to look on Henry as an adventurous soldier, and came to regard him as a great prince, fighting for his own. Beyond this, however, the effect was not immediate. Paris remained in the hands of the League. A Spanish League was formed. The difficulties seemed to grow deeper. The only easy solution to them was an abjuration of the Protestant faith, and to this view Henry in the end came. He professed conversion to Catholicism, and all opposition ceased. Henry IV. became the fully acknowledged King of France, and for the time being all persecution of the Huguenots was at an end. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. Is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. Chapter 19 The Murder of a King. History is full of stories of presentiments, of visions of sudden death, made notable by their realization, of strange disasters predicted in advance. Doubtless there have been very many presentiments that failed to come true, enough, possibly, to make those that have been realized mere coincidences. However that be, these agreements of prediction and event are, to say the least, curious. The case of Caesar is well known. We have now to relate that of Henry IV. Sully has told the story. Henry had married, as a second wife, Mary de Medici, daughter of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and a woman whose headstrong temper and cantankerous disposition were by no means calculated to make his life with her an agreeable one. In the end she strongly insisted on being crowned queen, a desire on her part which was very unpleasant to her royal husband, who seemed to feel that some disaster impended over the event. "Hey, my friend," he said to Sully, his intimate, "I know not what is the meaning of it, but my heart tells me that some misfortune will happen to me." He was seated on a low chair, his face disturbed by uneasy thought, his fingers drumming on his spectacle case. Of a sudden he sprang up and struck his hand sharply on his thigh. "By God," he said, "I shall die in this city, and shall never go out of it. They will kill me. I see quite well that they have no other remedy in their dangers but my death. Ah, accursed coronation, thou wilt be the cause of my death." "What fancy is this of yours?" asked Sully. "If it continue, I am of opinion that you should break off this anointment and coronation. If you please to give me orders, it shall be done." "Yes, break off the coronation," said the king. "Let me hear no more about it. I shall have my mind at rest from diverse fancies which certain warnings have put into it. To hide nothing from you, I have been told that I was to be killed at the first grand ceremony I should undertake, and that I should die in a carriage." "You never told me that, sir," answered Sully. "I have often been astounded to hear you cry out, when in a carriage, as if you dreaded this petty peril, after having so many times seen you amidst cannon balls, musketry, lance thrusts, pike thrusts, and sword thrusts, without being a bit afraid. Since your mind is so exercised thereby, if I were you I would go away to-morrow, let the coronation take place without you, or put it off to another time, and not enter Paris for a long time, or in a carriage. If you please, I will send word to Notre Dame and Saint Denis to stop everything, and to withdraw the workmen." "I am very much inclined," said the king, "but what will my wife say? She has gotten this coronation marvellously into her head." "She may say what she likes," rejoined Sully, "but I cannot think that when she knows your opinion about it, she will persist any longer." He did not know Mary de Medici. She did persist strongly and offensively. For 3 days the matter was disputed, with high words on both sides. In the end, Henry, weary of the contention, and finding it impossible to convince or silence his obstinate wife, gave way, and the labourers were again set to work to prepare for the coronation. Despite his presentiments, Henry remained in Paris, and gave orders for the immediate performance of the ceremony, as if he were anxious to have done with it, and to pass the crisis in his life which he feared. The coronation was proclaimed on the 12th of May, 1610. It took place on the 13th at Saint Denis. The tragical event which he had dreaded did not take place. He breathed easier. On the next day, the 14th, he took it in mind to go to the Arsenal to see Sully, who was ill. Yet the same indecision and fear seemed to possess him. He stirred about in an unquiet and irresolute mood, saying several times to the Queen, "My dear, shall I go or not?" He went so far as to leave the room 2 or 3 times, but each time returned in the same doubt. "My dear, shall I really go?" he said to the Queen, and then, making up his mind, he kissed her several times and bade her adieu. "I shall only go there and back," he said. "I shall be here again almost directly." On reaching his carriage, Monsieur de Praslin, the captain of his guard, proposed to attend him, but he would not permit it, saying, "Get you gone, I want nobody. Go about your business." Yet that morning, in a conversation with Guise and Bassompierre, he had spoken as if he dreaded quickly coming death. "You will live, please God, long years yet," said Bassompierre. "You are only in the flower of your age, in perfect bodily health and strength, full of honour more than any mortal man, in the most flourishing kingdom in the world, loved and adored by your subjects, with fine houses, fine women, fine children who are growing up." Henry sighed, as if still oppressed by his presentiments, and sadly answered, "My friend, all that must be left." Those were his last words of which any record remains, save the few he spoke in the carriage. A few hours afterwards, all the earthly blessings of which Bassompierre spoke were naught to him. The king was dead. To return to our subject, in the carriage with the king were several gentlemen of the court. Henry occupied the rear seat at the left, with Monsieur d'Epernon seated at his right, and Monsieur de Montbazon between him and the door, while several other gentlemen occupied the remaining seats. When the carriage reached the Croix de Tiroir, the coachman asked whither he should drive, and was bidden to go towards Saint Innocent. On the way thither, while in the Rue de la Ferronnerie, a cart obstructed the way, so that the carriage had to turn towards the sidewalk, and to proceed more slowly. Here were some ironmongers' shops, beside one of which lurked a man, his eyes keenly fixed on the approaching carriage, his hand nervously clutching some object in his pocket. As the carriage moved slowly by, this man sprang from his covert and rushed towards it, a knife in hand. In an instant he had dealt the king 2 blows in rapid succession, in the left side. The first struck him below the armpit and went upward, merely grazing the flesh. The other proved more dangerous. It entered his side between the 5th and 6th ribs, and taking a downward direction, cut a large blood vessel. The king, by chance, had his left hand on the shoulder of Monsieur de Montbazon, and was leaning towards Monsieur d'Epernon, to whom he was speaking. He thus laid himself more fully open to the assassin's knife. All had passed so quickly that no movement of defence was possible. Henry gave a low cry, and made a few movements. "What is the matter, sir?" asked Monsieur de Montbazon, who had not seen the affair. "It is nothing," answered the king. "It is nothing," he repeated, his voice now so low that they could barely hear him. Those were the last words he spoke. The assassin had been seized. He was a fanatic named Francois Ravaillac, who had been roused to his mad act by rumours that Henry intended to make war upon the Pope, and other baseless fancies of the king's opponents. With him we are not further concerned, other than to say he was made to suffer the most barbarous tortures for his deed. The carriage was turned and driven back toward the Louvre. On reaching the entrance steps, some wine was given to the wounded monarch. An officer of the guard raised his head, his only sign of intelligence being some movements of the eyes. In a moment more they were closed, never to be opened again. He was carried upstairs and laid on the couch in his closet, and from there taken to the bed in his chamber. As he lay there, some one gave him holy water, and Monsieur de Vicq, a councillor of state, put to his mouth the cross of his order, and directed his thoughts to God. All this was lost on the king. He lay motionless and insensible. All around him were in tears. The grief of the queen was inconsolable. All Paris was weeping. The monarch against whom the Parisians had so bitterly fought, they now mourned as they would have done for their dearest friend. The surgeons wanted to dress the king's wounds. Milon, the chief physician, who sat weeping at the bedside, waved them aside. A faint sigh died away on the king's lips. "It is all over," said Milon sadly. "He is gone." What followed may be told in a few words. The old adage, "The king is dead, long live the king," was the thought of practical men of affairs. Sully, whom the news of the assassination had raised in haste from his sick bed, put himself quickly at the head of some 40 horse and rode towards the palace. Guise and Bassompierre had come to the door to see what was passing outside as he rode up. "Gentlemen," he said to them with tearful eyes, "if the service you vowed to the king be impressed upon your souls as deeply as it ought to be with all good Frenchmen, swear this moment to keep towards the king's son and heir the same allegiance that you showed him, and to spend your lives and your blood in avenging his death." "Sir," answered Bassompierre, "it is for us to cause this oath to be taken by others. We have no need to be exhorted thereto." Leaving them, Sully rode to the Bastille, which he took possession of, and sent out soldiers to seize and carry off all the bread that could be found in the market and at the shops of the bakers. He dispatched a messenger also in the greatest haste to his son-in-law, Monsieur de Rohan, then in command of a force of 6,000 Swiss, bidding him to march with all speed upon Paris. Henry IV. was dead. His son was his legitimate successor, but the murder of Henry III. had been followed by a contest for the throne. That of Henry IV. might be. Sully felt it necessary to take precautions, although the king was hardly cold in death. The king dies, the kingship survives. Prudent men, on whom the peace of a people depend, prepare without delay. The Duc de Sully was such a man. His precautions, however, were not needed. No one thought of opposing the heirship of the king's son. CHAPTER 20. Of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. Recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. Chapter 20. Richelieu and the Conspirators. In a richly furnished state apartment of the royal palace of the Luxembourg, on a day in November 1630, stood Louis XIII., King of France, tapping nervously with his fingers on the window-pane, and with a disturbed and irresolute look upon his face. Beside him was his favourite, Saint-Simon, a showily dressed and handsome gentleman of the court. "What do you think of all this?" asked the king, his fingers keeping up their idle drumming on the glass. "Sir, I seem to be in another world," was the politic reply, "but at any rate you are master." "I am," said the king proudly, "and I will make it felt too." The royal prisoner was stirring uneasily in the bonds which hard necessity had cast round his will. It was against Cardinal Richelieu that his testy remark was made, yet in the very speaking he could not but feel that to lose Richelieu was to lose the bulwark of his throne, that this imperious master, against whose rule he chafed, was the glory and the support of his reign. Just now, however, the relations between king and cardinal were sadly strained. Mary de Medici, the king's mother, once Richelieu's ardent friend, was now his active foe. The queen, Anne of Austria, was equally hostile. Their influence had been used to its utmost to poison the mind of the monarch against his minister, and seemingly with success. To all appearance it looked as if the great cardinal was near his fall. Rumour of what was afloat had invaded the court. Everywhere were secret whisperings, knowing looks, expectant movements. Marillac, the courtiers were flocking to the Luxembourg, in hopes of some advantage to themselves. Marillac, the keeper of the seals, was at his country house at Glatigny, very near Versailles, where the king was expected. He remained there in hopes that Louis would send for him and put the power of the disgraced cardinal into his hands. The colossus seemed about to fall. All waited expectantly. The conspiracy of the queen mother had gone farther than to use her personal influence with her son against the cardinal. There were others in league with her, particularly Marillac, the keeper of the seals, and Marshal Marillac, his brother, then in command of a large force in Piedmont. All had been carefully prepared against the fall of the minister. The astute conspirators had fully laid their plans as to what was to follow. Unfortunately for them, they did not reckon with the two principal parties concerned, Louis XIII. And Cardinal Richelieu. With all his weaknesses of temper and mind, the king had intellect enough to know what were the great interests of his kingdom and power, and on whose shoulders they rested. Above all the littleness of a court cabal, he could not but discern the great questions which impended, and with which he felt quite incompetent to deal. And he could perceive but one man in his kingdom able to handle these great problems of state. As for Richelieu, he was by no means blind to what was going on around him. He was the last man in the world to be a dupe. Delaying until the time seemed ripe to move, he requested and obtained an interview with the king. They were a long time closeted, while all the courtier world of Paris waited in expectation and suspense. What passed in that private cabinet of the palace no one knew, but when the interview was over, it quickly became evident that the queen mother and her associates had lost, the cardinal had won. Michael de Marillac had hopeful dreams that night, as he slept in his house at Glatigny, but when he awoke in the morning it was to receive the disturbing news that the king and the cardinal were at Versailles together, the minister being lodged in a room under that of the monarch. Quickly came still more disturbing news. The king demanded a return of the seals. Before this tidings could be well digested, the frightened plotter learned that his own arrest had been ordered, and that the exons were already at his door to secure his person. While the courtier conspirator was thus being attended to, the soldier, his brother, was not forgotten. A courier had been dispatched to the headquarters of the army in Piedmont, bearing a letter to Marshal Schomberg, who, with Marshals Laforce and Marillac, had formed there a junction of the forces under their control. Marillac was in command on the day of the courier's arrival, and was impatiently awaiting the news, for which he had been prepared by his brother, of the cardinal's disgrace. Schomberg opened his dispatches. The first words he saw in the king's own handwriting were these: My dear cousin, you will not fail to arrest Marshal Marillac. It is for the good of my service, and for your own exculpation." Schomberg looked at the document with startled eyes. What could this mean? And was it safe to attempt an arrest? A large section of the troops were devoted to Marillac. He consulted with La Force, who advised him to obey orders, whatever the consequences. Schomberg thereupon showed Marillac the dispatch. He beheld it with surprise and alarm, but without thought of resistance. "I can protest that I have done nothing contrary to the king's service," he said. "The truth is that my brother, the keeper of the seals, and I have always been the servants of the Queen Mother. She must have had the worst of it, and Cardinal Richelieu has won the day against her and her servants." So it proved indeed, and he was to suffer for it. He was tried, not on any political charge, however. The crimes alleged against him were peculation and extortion, common practices with many of his fellow generals. "It is a very strange thing," said he, bitterly, "to prosecute me as they do. My trial is a mere question of hay, straw, wood, stones, and lime. There is not case enough for whipping a lackey." He was mistaken. There was case enough for beheading a marshal. It was not a question of peculation, but of offending the great cardinal, for which he was really put on trial, and the case ended in his being found guilty of malfeasance in office and executed. His brother died in prison 3 months afterwards, of decline, so the records say. Dupes' day, as the day we have described came to be called, was over. The Queen Mother had lost. Her dupes had suffered. Richelieu was more powerful than ever. She had but strengthened his ascendency over the king. But Mary de Medici was not the woman to acknowledge defeat easily. No sooner had her first effort failed than her enmity against the too powerful minister showed itself in a new direction, the principal agent of her purposes being now her son, the Duke of Orleans, brother to the king. The Duke, after an angry interview with the cardinal, left Paris in haste for Orleans, his mother declaring to the king that the occasion of his sudden departure was that he could no longer tolerate by his presence Richelieu's violent proceedings against herself. She professed to have been taken by surprise by his departure, which, Louis doubting, she took occasion to belch forth fire and flames against the cardinal, and make a fresh attempt to ruin him in the king's estimation, though she had previously bound herself by oath to take no more steps against him. Her malignity defeated itself. Richelieu was too skilful an adept in the game of politics to be so easily beaten. He brought the affair before the council, seemingly utterly indifferent what might be done. The trouble might be ended, he suggested, by his own retirement, or that of the Queen Mother, whichever, in their wisdom, they might deem best. The implied threat settled the matter. The king, alarmed at the idea of having the government of France left on his weak hands, at once gave the offending lady to understand that she had better retire for a time to one of his provincial palaces, recommending Moulins. Mary de Medici heard this order with fiery indignation. She shut herself up in the castle of Compiègne, where she then was, and declared that she would not leave unless dragged out by main force. In the end, however, she changed her mind, fled by night from the castle, and made her way to Brussels, where she took refuge from her powerful foe. Richelieu's game was won. Mary de Medici had lost all influence with her son. She was never to see him again. A number of years passed before a new plot was hatched against the cardinal. Then a conspiracy was organized, which threatened not only his power, but his life. It was in 1636. The king's headquarters were then at the castle of Demuin. The Duke of Orleans, who had been recently in armed rebellion against the king, and had been pardoned for his treason, determined, in common with the Count of Soissons, that their enemy, the cardinal, should die. There were others in this plot of assassination, 2 of the duke's gentlemen, Montresor and Saint-Ibal, being chosen to deal the fatal blow. They were to station themselves at the foot of the grand stairway, meet Richelieu at his exit from the council, and strike him dead. The duke was to give the signal for the murderous assault. The door of the council chamber opened. The king and the cardinal came out together, and ascended the stairs in company, Richelieu attending Louis until he had reached the foot of the stairway, and gone into an adjoining room. The cardinal turned to ascend again, without a moment's suspicion that the 2 gentlemen at the stair-foot clutched hidden daggers in their hands, ready, at a signal from the duke, who stood near by, to plunge them in his breast. The signal did not come. At the last moment the courage of Gaston of Orleans failed him. Whether from something in Richelieu's earnest and dignified aspect, or some sudden fear of serious consequences to himself, the chief conspirator turned hastily away, without speaking the fatal word agreed upon. What the Duke feared to do, the Count dared not to do. The two chosen assassins stood expectant, greeting the cardinal as he passed, and waiting in nervous impatience for the promised signal. It failed to come. Their daggers remained undrawn. Richelieu calmly ascended the stairs to his rooms, without a dream of the deadly peril he had run. The conspiracy against the cardinal which has attained the greatest historical notoriety is that associated with the name of Cinq-Mars, the famous favourite of Louis XIII. Brilliant and witty, a true type of the courtiers of the time, this handsome youth so amused and interested the king, that when he was only 19 years of age, Louis made him master of the wardrobe and Grand Equerry of France. Monsieur le Grand he was called, and grand enough he seemed, in his independent and capricious dealings with the king. Louis went so far as to complain to Richelieu of the humours of his youthful favourite. "I am very sorry," he wrote under date of January 4th, 1641, "to trouble you about the ill tempers of Monsieur le Grand. I upbraided him with his heedlessness. He answered that for that matter he could not change, and that he should do no better than he had done. I said that, considering his obligations to me, he ought not to address me in that manner. He answered in his usual way, that he didn't want my kindness, that he could do very well without it, and that he would be quite as well content to be Cinq-Mars as Monsieur le Grand, but as for changing his ways and his life, he couldn't do it. And so, he continually nagging at me, and I at him, we came as far as the courtyard, where I said to him that being in the temper he was in, he would do me the pleasure of not coming to see me. I have not seen him since." This letter yields a curious revelation of the secret history of a royal court. There have been few kings with whom such impudent independence would have served. Louis XIII. was one of them. Cinq-Mars seemed to have known his man. The quarrel was not of long continuance. Richelieu, who had first placed the youth near the king, easily reconciled them, a service which the foolish boy soon repaid by lending an ear to the enemies of the cardinal. For this Richelieu was in a way responsible. He had begun to find the constant attendance of his favourite upon the king troublesome to himself, and gave him plainly to understand so. One day he sent word to him not to be for the future so continually at his heels, and treated him even to his face with as much tartness and imperiousness as if he had been the lowest of his valets. Such treatment was not likely to be well received by one of the independent disposition of Cinq-Mars. He joined in a plot against the cardinal. The king was ill, the cardinal more so. Gaston, Duke of Orleans, was again in Paris, and full of his old intriguing spirit. The Duke of Bouillon was there also, having been sent for by the king to take command of the army of Italy. He, too, was drawn into the plot which was being woven against Richelieu. The Queen, Anne of Austria, was another of the conspirators. The plot thus organized was the deepest and most far-reaching which had yet been laid against the all-powerful minister. Bouillon was Prince Sovereign of the town of Sedan. This place was to serve the conspirators as an asylum in case of reverse. But a town was not enough, an army was needed. Whence should it come? Spain might furnish it. The affair was growing to the dimensions of a conspiracy against the crown as well as the minister. Vicomte de Fontrailles, a man who detested the cardinal, and would not have hesitated to murder him as a simpler way of disposing of the difficulty, was named by Cinq-Mars as a proper person to deal with the Spaniards. He set out for Madrid, and soon succeeded in negotiating a secret treaty in the name of the Duke of Orleans, by whose terms Spain was to furnish the conspirators with 12,000 foot, 5,000 horse, and the necessary funds for the enterprise. The town of Sedan, and the name of Cinq-Mars and Bouillon were not mentioned in this treaty, but were given in a separate document. While this dangerous work was going on, the cardinal was dangerously ill, a prey to violent fever, and with an abscess on his arm which prevented him from writing. The king was with the army, which was besieging Perpignan. With him was Cinq-Mars, who was doing his best to insinuate suspicions of the minister into the mind of the king. All seemed promising for the conspirators, the illness of the cardinal, in their opinion, being likely to carry him off in no long period, and meanwhile preventing him from discovering the plot and setting himself right with the king. Evidently these hopeful people did not know the resources of Cardinal Richelieu. In all his severe illness his eyes had not been blind, his intellect not at rest. Keen as they thought themselves, they had a man with double their resources to deal with. Though Richelieu was by no means surrounded by the intricate web of spies and intrigues with which fiction and drama have credited him, he was not without his secret agents, and his means of tracing the most hidden movements of his enemies. Cinq-Mars lacked the caution necessary for a conspirator. His purposes became evident to the king, who had no thought of exchanging his great minister for a frivolous boy who was only fitted to amuse his hours of relaxation. The outcome of the affair appears in a piece of news published in the Gazette de France on June 21st, 1642. The Cardinal Duke, it said, after remaining 2 days at Arles, embarked on the 11th of this month for Tarascon, his health becoming better and better. The king has ordered under arrest Marquis de Cinq-Mars, Grand Equerry of France. Had a thunderbolt fallen in their midst, the enemies of Richelieu could not have been in greater consternation than at this simple item of news. How came it about? The fox was not asleep, nor had his illness robbed his hand and his brain of their cunning. The king, overladen with affairs of state from which his minister, when well, had usually relieved him, sent a message of confidence to Richelieu, indicating that his enemies would seek in vain to separate them. In reply, the cardinal sent the king a document which filled the monarch with an astonishment that was only equalled by his wrath. It was a copy of the secret treaty of Orleans with Spain. The king could hardly believe his eyes. So this was what lay behind the insinuations of Cinq-Mars. An insurrection was projected against the state. The cardinal, mayhap the king himself, was to be overthrown by force of arms. Only the sleepless vigilance of Richelieu could have discovered and exposed this perilous plot. It remained for the king to second the work of his minister by decisive action. An order was at once issued for the arrest of Cinq-Mars and his intimate friend, M. de Thou, while a messenger was sent off in all haste to the army of Italy, bearing orders for the arrest of the Duke of Bouillon at the head of his troops. Fontrailles, just arrived from his mission to Spain, returned to that kingdom with all haste, having first said to Cinq-Mars, "Sir, you are a fine figure. If you were shorter by the whole head, you would not cease to be very tall. As for me, who am already very short, nothing could be taken off me without inconveniencing me, and making me cut the poorest figure in the world. You will be good enough, if you please, to let me get out of the way of edge-tools." The minor parties to the conspiracy, with the exception of the prudent Fontrailles, were in custody. The most guilty of all, the king's brother, was at large. What part was he to play in the drama of retribution? Flight, or treachery to his accomplices, alone remained to him. He chose the latter, sending an agent to the king, who had just joined the cardinal at Tarascon, with directions to confess everything and implore for him the pardon of his royal brother. The cardinal questioned this agent, the Abbé de la Rivière, with unrelenting severity, made him write and sign everything, and was inclined to make the Prince Duke appear as a witness at the trial, and yield up his accomplices in the face of the world. This final disgrace, however, was omitted at the wish of Louis, and an order of exile was sent from the king to his brother, which bore this note in the cardinal's hand: "Monsieur will have in his place of exile 12,000 crowns a month, the same sum that the King of Spain had promised to give him." The dying cardinal had triumphed over all his foes. He had from his bed at Tarascon dictated to the king the course to be pursued, entailing dishonour to the Duke of Orleans and death to the Grand Equerry of France. The king then took his way back to Fontainebleau in the litter of the cardinal, which the latter had lent him. Richelieu did not remain long behind him. He was conveyed to his house in Lyons in a litter shaped like a square chamber, covered with red damask, and borne on the shoulders of 18 guards. Within, beside his couch, was a table covered with papers, at which he worked with his ordinary diligence, chatting pleasantly at intervals with such of his servants as accompanied him. In the same equipage he left Lyons for the Loire, on his return to Paris. On the way it was necessary to pull down walls and bridge ditches that this great litter, in which the greatest man in France lay in mortal illness, might pass. What followed needs few words. The Duke of Bouillon confessed everything, and was pardoned on condition of his delivering up Sedan to the king. He was kept in prison, however, till after the death of his accomplices Cinq-Mars and de Thou, who were tried and sentenced to execution. Bouillon had not long to wait. The execution took place on the very day on which sentence had been pronounced. The two culprits met death firmly. Cinq-Mars was but 22 years of age. He had rapidly run his course. Now that I make not a single step which does not lead me to death, I am more capable than anybody else of estimating the value of the things of the world. Enough of this world, away to paradise, said de Thou, as he walked to the scaffold. There were no more conspiracies against Richelieu. There was no time for them, for in less than 3 months afterwards he was dead. The greatest, or at least the most dramatic minister known to the pages of history, had departed from this world. His royal master did not long survive him. In 5 months afterwards, Louis XIII. Had followed his minister to the grave. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21. A Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. The Parliament of Paris. In the streets of Paris all was tumult and fiery indignation. Never had there been a more sudden or violent outbreak. The whole city seemed to have turned into the streets. Not until the era of the Revolution, a century and a half later, was the capital of France again to see such an uprising of the people against the court. Broussel had been arrested, Councillor Broussel, a favourite of the populace, who sustained him in his opposition to the court party, and at once the city was ablaze. For the first time in the history of France had the people risen in support of their representatives. It was by no means the first time that royalty had ended its disputes with the Parliament in this summary manner. 4 years previously, Anne of Austria, the Queen Regent, had done the same thing, and scarce a voice had been raised in protest. But in the ensuing 4 years public opinion had changed. The king, Louis XIV., was but 10 years old. His mother, aided by her favourite minister, Cardinal Mazarin, ruled the kingdom. Misruled it, as the people thought. The country was crushed under its weight of taxes. The finances were in utter disorder. France was successful abroad, but her successes had been dearly bought, and the people groaned under the burden of their victories. Parliament made itself the mouthpiece of the public discontent. It no longer felt upon it the iron hand of Richelieu. Mazarin was able, but he was not a master, and the Parliament began once more to claim that authority in affairs of state from which it had been deposed by the great cardinal. A conflict arose between the members and the court, which soon led to acts of open hostility. An edict laying a tax upon all provisions which entered Paris irritated the citizens, and the Parliament refused to register it. Other steps towards independence were taken by the members. Gradually they resumed their old rights, and the court party was forced to yield. But courage returned to the Queen Regent with the news that the army of France had gained a great victory. No sooner had the tidings reached Paris than the city was electrified by hearing that President Blancmesnil and Councillor Broussel had been arrested. It was the arrest of Broussel that stirred the popular heart. Mazarin and the Queen had made the dangerous mistake of not taking into account the state of the public mind. There was a blaze at once, a sensation, a rush, an outcry, and a shutting up of shops. The excitement of the people was intense. Moment by moment the tumult grew greater. "Broussel! Broussel!" they shouted. That perilous populace had arisen which was afterwards to show what frightful deeds it could do under the impulse of oppression and misgovernment. Paul de Gondi, afterwards known as Cardinal de Retz, then coadjutor of the Archbishop of Paris, and the leading spirit with the populace, hurried to the palace, accompanied by Marshal de la Meilleraie. "The city is in a frightful state," they told the Queen. "The people are furious, and may soon grow unmanageable. The air is full of revolt." Anne of Austria listened to them with set lips and angry eyes. "There is revolt in imagining there can be revolt," she sternly replied. "These are the ridiculous stories of those who favour trouble. The king's authority will soon restore order." Monsieur de Guitant, an old courtier, who entered as she was speaking, declared that the coadjutor had barely represented the facts, and said that he did not see how anybody could sleep with things in such a state. "Well, Monsieur de Guitant, and what is your advice?" asked de Retz. "My advice is to give up that old rascal of a Broussel, dead or alive." "To give him up dead," said the coadjutor, "would not accord with either the piety or the prudence of the Queen. To yield him alive might quiet the people." The Queen turned to him a face hot with anger, and exclaimed, "I understand you, Mr. Coadjutor. You would have me set Broussel at liberty. I would strangle him with these hands first." As she finished these words she put her hands close to the coadjutor's face, and added in a threatening tone, "And those who—" Her voice ceased. He was left to infer the rest. Yet despite this infatuation of the Queen, it was evident that something must be done if Paris was to be saved. The people grew more tumultuous. Fresh tidings continued to come in, each more threatening than the last. The Queen at length yielded so far as to promise that Broussel should be set free if the people would first disperse and cease their tumultuous behaviour. The coadjutor was bidden to proclaim this in the streets. He asked for an order to sustain him, but the Queen refused to give it, and withdrew to her little grey room, angry at herself for yielding so far as she had. De Retz did not find the situation a very pleasant one for himself. Mazarin pushed him gently towards the door, saying, restore the peace of the realm. Marshal Meilleraye drew him onward. He went into the street, wearing his robe of office, and bestowing benedictions right and left, though while doing so his mind was busy in considering how he was going to get out of the difficulty which lay before him. It grew worse instead of better. Marshal Meilleraye, losing his head through excitement, advanced waving his sword in the air, and shouting at the top of his voice, "Hurrah for the king! Liberation for Bruxelles!" This did very well for those within hearing, but his sword provoked far more than his voice quieted. Those at a distance looked on his action as a menace, and their fury was augmented. On all sides there was a rush for arms. Stones were flung by the rioters, one of which struck de Retz and felled him to the earth. As he picked himself up, an excited youth rushed at him and put a musket to his head. Only the wit and readiness of the coadjutor saved him from imminent peril. "Though I did not know him a bit," says de Retz in his Memoirs, "I thought it would not be well to let him suppose so at such a moment. On the contrary, I said to him, 'Ah, wretch, if thy father saw thee!' He thought I was the best friend of his father, on whom, however, I had never set eyes." The fellow withdrew, ashamed of his violence, and before any further attack could be made upon de Retz, he was recognized by the people, and dragged to the market-place, constantly crying out as he went, "The Queen has promised to restore Bruxelles!" The good news by this time had spread through the multitude, whose cries of anger were giving place to shouts of joy. Their arms were hastily disposed of, and a great throng, 30,000 or 40,000 in number, followed the coadjutor to the Palais Royal. When he entered, Marshal Meilleraye turned to the Queen and said, "Madame, here is he to whom I owe my life, and your Majesty the safety of the Palais Royal." The Queen's answer was an incredulous smile. On seeing it, the hasty temper of the Marshal broke out in an oath. "Madame," he said hotly, "no proper man can venture to flatter you in the state in which things are, and if you do not this very day set Bruxelles at liberty, to-morrow there will not be left one stone upon another in Paris." Anne of Austria, carried away by her pride and superciliousness, could not be brought to believe that the populace would dare attempt an actual revolt against the king. De Retz would have spoken in support of the Marshal's words, but she cut him short, saying in a tone of mockery, "Go and rest yourself, sir, you have worked very hard." He left the palace in a rage. It was increased when word was brought to him that he had been ridiculed at the supper table of the Queen. She had gone so far as to blame him for increasing the tumult, and threatened to make an example of him, and to interdict the Parliament. In short, the exercise of power had made the woman mad. De Retz reflected. If the Queen designed to punish him, she should have something to punish him for. He was not the man to be made a cat's paw of. "We are not in such a bad case as you suppose, gentlemen," he said to his friends. "There is an intention of crushing the public. It is for me to defend it from oppression. To-morrow, before midday, I shall be master of Paris." Anne of Austria had made an enemy of one who had been her strong friend, a bold and restless man, capable of great deeds. He had long taken pains to make himself popular in Paris. During that night he and his emissaries worked in secret upon the people. Early the next day the mob was out again, arms in hand, and ripe for mischief. The Chancellor, on his way to the Palace of Justice, suddenly found his carriage surrounded by these rioters. He hastily sought refuge in the Hôtel de Lune. The mob followed him, pillaging as they went, destroying the furniture, seeking the fugitive. He had taken refuge in a small chamber, where, thinking that his last hour had come, he knelt in confession before his brother, the Bishop of Meaux. Fortunately for him, the rioters failed to discover him, and were led away by another fancy. "It was like a sudden and violent conflagration lighted up from the Pont Neuf over the whole city," says de Retz. "Everybody, without exception, took up arms. Children of 5 and 6 years of age were seen, dagger in hand, and the mothers themselves carried them. In less than 2 hours there were in Paris more than 200 barricades, bordered with flags, and all the arms that the League had left entire. Everybody cried, 'Hurrah for the king!' but echo answered, 'None of your Mazarin!'" It was an incipient revolution, but it was the minister and the regent, not the king, against whom the people had risen, its object being the support of the Parliament of Paris, not the States General of the kingdom. France was not yet ready for the radical work reserved for a later day. The turbulent Parisians were in the street, arms in hand, but they had not yet lost the sentiment of loyalty to the king. A century and a half more of misrule were needed to complete this transformation in the national idea. While all this was going on, the coadjutor, the soul of the outbreak, kept at home, vowing that he was powerless to control the people. At an early hour the Parliament assembled at the Palace of Justice, but its deliberations were interrupted by shouts of "Bruxelles! Bruxelles!" from the immense multitude which filled every adjoining avenue. Only the release of the arrested members could appease the mob. The Parliament determined to go in a body and demand this of the Queen. Their journey was an eventful one. Paris was in insurrection. Everywhere they found the people in arms, while barricades were thrown up at every 100 paces. Through the shouting and howling mob they made their way to the Queen's palace, the ushers in front with their square caps, the members following in their robes, at their head Monsieur Molé, their premier president. The conference with the Queen was a passionate one. Monsieur Molé spoke for the Parliament, representing to the Queen the extreme danger Paris was in, the peril to all France unless the prisoners were released, and the sedition allayed. He spoke to a woman who feared nothing because she knew but little, and who was just then controlled by pride and passion instead of reason. "I am quite aware that there is a disturbance in the city," she said furiously, "but you shall answer to me for it, gentlemen of Parliament, you, your wives, and your children." With further threats that the king would remember the cause of these evils when he reached his majority, the incensed woman flouted from the chamber of audience, slamming the door violently behind her. To deal with her in her present mood was evidently impracticable. The members left the palace to return. They quickly found themselves surrounded by an angry mob, furious at their non-success, disposed to hold them responsible for the failure. On their arrival at the Rue Saint-Honoré, just as they were about to turn on to the Pont Neuf, a band of about 200 men advanced threateningly upon them, headed by a cook-shop lad, armed with a halberd, which he thrust against Monsieur Molé's body, crying, "Turn, traitor, and if thou wouldst not thyself be slain, give up to us Broussel, or Mazarin and the Chancellor as hostages." Molé quietly put the weapon aside. "You forget yourself," he said, with calm dignity, "and are oblivious of the respect you owe to my office." The mob, however, was past the point of paying respect to dignitaries. They hustled the members, threatened the president with swords and pistols, and several times tried to drag him into a private house. But he resisted, and was aided by members and friends who surrounded him. Slowly the parliamentary body made its way back to the Palais Royal, whither they had resolved to return, Monsieur Molé preserving his dignity of mien and movement despite the running fire of insults, threats, execrations, and blasphemies that arose from every side. They reached the palace at length in diminished numbers, many of the members having dropped out of the procession. The whole court was assembled in the gallery. Molé spoke first. He was a man of great natural eloquence, who was at his best as an orator when surrounded by peril, and he depicted the situation so graphically that all present, except for the Queen, were in terror. "Monsieur made as if he would throw himself upon his knees before the Queen, who remained inflexible," says De Retz. 4 or 5 princesses, who were trembling with fear, did throw themselves at her feet. The Queen of England, who had come that day from Saint Germain, represented that the troubles had never been so serious at their commencement in England, nor the feelings so heated or united. Paris, in short, was on the eve of a revolution, and the Queen could not be made to see it. Cardinal Mazarin, who was present, and who had been severely dealt with in the speeches, some of the orators telling him, in mockery, that if he would only go so far as the Pont Neuf, he would learn for himself how things were, now joined the others in entreating Anne of Austria to give way. She did so at length, consenting to the release of Broussel, though not without a deep sigh, which showed what violence she did her feelings in the struggle. It is an interesting spectacle to see this woman, moved by sheer pride and obstinacy, conjoined with ignorance of the actual situation, seeking to set her single will against that of a city in revolt, and endangering the very existence of the monarchy by her sheer lack of reason. Her consent for the time being settled the difficulty, though the passions which had been aroused were not easily to be set at rest. Broussel was released and took his seat again in the Parliament, and the people returned to their homes, satisfied for the time with their victory over the Queen and Cardinal. In truth, a contest had arisen which was yet to yield important consequences. The Prince of Condé had arrived in Paris during these events. He had the prestige of a successful general, he did not like the cardinal, and he looked on the Parliament as imprudent and insolent. "If I should join hands with them," he said to De Retz, "it might be best for my interests, but my name is Louis de Bourbon, and I do not wish to shake the throne. These devils of square caps, are they mad about bringing me either to commence a civil war, or to put a rope around their own necks? I will let them see that they are not the potentates they think themselves, and that they may easily be brought to reason." "The cardinal may possibly be mistaken in his measures," answered De Retz. "He will find Paris a hard nut to crack." "It will not be taken, like Dunkirk, by mining and assaults," retorted the prince angrily. "But if the bread of Gonesse were to fail them for a week—" He left the coadjutor to imagine the consequences. The contest continued. In January 1649, the queen, the boy king, and the whole court set out by night for the castle of Saint Germain. It was unfurnished, with scarcely a bundle of straw to lie upon, but the queen could not have been more gay had she won a battle, taken Paris, and had all who displeased her hanged, and nevertheless she was very far from all that. Far enough, indeed. Paris was in the hands of her enemies, who were as gay as the queen. On the 8th of January the Parliament of Paris decreed Cardinal Mazarin an enemy to the king and the state, and bade all subjects of the king to hunt him down. War was declared against the queen regent and her favourite, the cardinal. Had it been the States General in place of the Parliament, the French Revolution might have then and there begun. Many of the greatest lords joined the side of the people. Troops were levied in the city, their command being offered to the Prince of Conti. The Parliaments of Aix and Rouen voted to support that of Paris. It was decided that all the royal funds in the exchequers of the kingdom should be seized and used for the defence of the people. All was festivity in the city. The versatile people seemed to imagine that to declare war was to decree victory. There was dancing everywhere within the walls. There was the rumble of war without. The Prince of Condé, at the head of the king's troops, had taken the post of Charenton from the Frondeurs, as the malcontents called themselves, and had carried out his threat of checking the flow of bread to the city. The gay Parisians were beginning to feel the inconvenience of hunger. What followed is too long a story to be told here, except in bare epitome. A truce was patched up between the contending parties. Bread flowed again into Paris. The seared and hungry people grew courageous and violent again when their appetites were satisfied. When M. Molé and his fellows returned to Paris with a treaty of peace which they had signed, the populace gathered round them in fury. "None of your peace! None of your Mazarin!" they angrily shouted. "We must go to Saint Germain to seek our good king. We must fling into the river all the Mazarins." One of them laid his hand threateningly on President Molé's arm. The latter looked him in the face calmly. "When you have killed me," he said quietly, "I shall only need 6 feet of earth." "You can get back to your house secretly by way of the record offices," whispered one of his companions. "The court never hides itself," he composedly replied. "If I were certain to perish, I would not commit this poltroonery, which, moreover, would but give courage to the rioters. They would seek me in my house if they thought I shrank from them here." M. Molé was a man of courage. To face a mob is at times more dangerous than to face an army. Paris was in disorder. The agitation was spreading all over France. But the army was faithful to the king, and without it the Fronde was powerless. The outbreak had ended in a treaty of peace and amnesty, in which the Parliament had in a measure won, as it had preserved all its rights and privileges. It was to be a short peace. Condé, elated by having beaten the Fronde, claimed a lion's share in the government. His brother, the Prince of Conti, and his sister, the Duchess of Longueville, joined him in these pretensions. The affair ended in a bold step on the part of Mazarin and the queen. The two princes and M. de Longueville were arrested and conveyed to the castle of Vincennes, while the princesses were ordered to retire to their estates, and the Duchess of Longueville, fearing arrest, fled in haste to Normandy. For the present, the star of the cardinal was in the ascendant, but his masterstroke set war on foot again. The Parliament of Paris supported the princes, their partisans rallied, Bordeaux broke into insurrection. Elsewhere hot blood declared itself. The Duke of Orleans joined the party of the prisoners. The Parliament enjoined all the officers of the crown to obey none but the Duke, the lieutenant general of the kingdom. On the night of February 6, 1651, Mazarin set out again for Saint Germain. Paris had become far too hot to hold him. The tidings of his flight brought the people into the streets again. The Duke of Orleans informed Cardinal de Retz that the queen proposed to follow her flying minister with the boy king. "What is to be done?" he asked, somewhat helplessly. "It is a bad business, but how are we to stop it?" "How?" cried the more practical de Retz. "Why, by shutting the gates of Paris to begin with. The king must not go." Within an hour the emissaries of the ready coadjutor were rousing up the people right and left with the tidings of the projected flight of the queen with her son. Soon the city swarmed again with armed and angry men, the gates were seized, mounted guards patrolled the streets, the crowd surged towards the Palais Royal. Within the palace all was alarm and confusion. Anne of Austria had indeed been on the point of flight. Her son was in his travelling dress. But the people were at the door, clamouring to see the king, threatening dire consequences if the doors were not opened to them. They could not long be kept out. Some immediate action must be taken. The boy's travelling attire was quickly replaced by his night dress, and he was laid in bed, his mother cautioning him to lie quiet and feign sleep. "The king! We must see the king!" came the vociferous cry from the street. "Open! The people demand to see their king!" The doors were forced, the mob was in the palace, clamour and tumult reigned below the royal chambers. The queen sent word to the people that the king was asleep in his bed. They might enter and see him if they would promise to tread softly and keep strict silence. This message at once stopped the tumult. The noise subsided, the people began to file into the rooms, stepping as noiselessly as though shod with down, gazing with awed eyes on the seemingly sleeping face of the boy king. The queen stood at the pillow of her son, a graceful and beautiful woman, her outstretched arm holding back the heavy folds of the drapery, her face schooled to quiet repose. Louis lay with closed eyes and regular breathing, playing his part well. For hours a stream of the men and women of Paris flowed through the chamber, moving in reverential silence, gazing on the boy's face as on a sacred treasure of their own. Till 3 o'clock in the morning the movement continued, the queen standing all this time like a beautiful statue, her son still feigning slumber. It was a scene of remarkable and picturesque character. That night of strain and excitement passed. The king was with them still, of that the people were assured. He must remain with them. There must be an end of midnight flights. The patrol was kept up, the gates watched. The king was a prisoner in the hands of the Parisians. "The king, our master, is a captive," said Monsieur Molé, voicing to the Parliament the queen's complaint. "He was a captive in the hands of Mazarin," replied the Duke of Orleans, "but thank God he is so no longer." The people had won. Mazarin was beaten. He hastened to Le Havre, where the princes were then confined, and set them at liberty himself. His power in France for the time was at an end. He made his way to the frontier, which he crossed on the 12th of March. He was just in time. The Parliament of Paris had issued orders for his arrest wherever found in France. We must end here with this closing of the contest between Mazarin and the Fronde. History goes on to tell that the contest was reopened, Mazarin returned, there was a battle in Paris, the Fronde failed, and Mazarin died in office. The popular outbreak here briefly chronicled is of interest from the fact that it immediately followed the success of the insurrection in England and the execution of Charles I. The provocation was the same in the two nations, the result highly different. In both cases it was a revolt against the tyranny of the court and the attempt to establish absolutism. But the difference in results lay in the fact that England had a single parliament composed of politicians, while France had 10 parliaments composed of magistrates and unaccustomed to handle great questions of public policy. Richelieu had taken from the civic parliaments of France what little power they possessed, and they were but shadowy prototypes of the English representative assembly. Without any unity of action or aim, and by turns excited and dismayed by the examples that came to them from England, the Frondeurs had to guide them no Hampden or Cromwell. They had at their backs neither people nor army. The English had been able to accomplish a revolution. The Fronde failed before the dexterous prudence of Mazarin and the queen's fidelity to her minister. There lay before France a century and a half of autocratic rule and popular suffering. Then was to come the convening of the States General, the rise of the people, and the final downfall of absolute royalty and feudal privileges in the red tide of the Revolution. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22 A Martyr to His Profession. The grounds of the Château de Chantilly, that charming retreat of the Prince de Condé, shone with all the splendor which artistic adornments, gleaming lanterns of varied form and color, splendidly costumed dames, and richly attired cavaliers could give them, the whole scene having a fairy-like beauty and richness wonderfully pleasing to the eye. For more than a mile from the entrance to the grounds men holding lighted torches bordered the road, while in all the villages leading thither the peasants were out in their gala attire, and the triumphal arches of verdure were erected in honor of the king, Louis XIV., who was on his way thither to visit Monsieur le Prince. He was coming, the great Louis, the Grand Monarque of France, and noble and peasant alike were out to bid him welcome, while the artistic skill of the day had exhausted itself in efforts to provide him a splendid reception. And now there could be heard on the road the trampling of horses, the clanking of swords, the voices of approaching men, and a gallant cavalcade wheeled at length into the grounds, announcing that the king was close at hand. A few minutes of anxious expectation passed, and then the king, attended by a large group of courtiers, came sweeping grandly forward, while at the same time a gleaming display of fireworks at the end of the avenue blazed off in fiery greeting. As the coruscating lights faded out, Condé met the king in his coach, which he invited him to enter, and off they drove to the château, followed by a shining swarm of grand dames and great lords who had gathered to this fête from all parts of France. Within the château as much had been done as without to render honour to the occasion. Hundreds of retainers lined chamber and hall in splendid attire, their only duty being to add life and richness to the scene. The rooms were luxuriously furnished, the banqueting hall was a scene for a painter, and the banquet a triumph of the art of the cuisine, for was it not prepared by the genius of Vatel, the great Vatel, the most famous of cooks, ministering to the most showy of monarchs? All went well. The king feasted on delicacies which were a triumph of art. Louis was satisfied. Vatel triumphed. So far the fête was a success. In the evening the king played at piquet. The cavaliers and ladies promenaded through the splendidly furnished and richly lighted saloons. Some cracked jokes on sofas, some made love in alcoves. Still, all went well. For the next day the programme included a grand promenade à la mode de Versailles, a collation in the park, under great trees laden with the freshest verdure of spring, a stag hunt by moonlight, a brilliant display of fireworks, then a supper in the banqueting hall of the château. And still all went well. At least all thought so, but Vatel. But as for that prince of cooks, he was in despair. A frightful disaster had occurred. After the days and nights of anxiety and care in preparing for this grand occasion, for a failure now to take place, it was to him unpardonable, unsupportable. Tidings of his distress were brought to Condé. The generous prince sought his room to console him. "Vatel," said he, "what is this I hear? The king's supper was superb." "Monseigneur," said Vatel, tears in his eyes, "the rôti was wanting at 2 tables." "Not at all," replied the prince. "You surpassed yourself. Nothing could have been better. Everything was perfect." Vatel, somewhat relieved by this praise, sought his couch, and a morsel of sleep visited his eyelids, but the shadow of doom still hung over his career. By break of day he was up again. Others might lie late abed, but there could be no such indulgence for him, for was he not the power behind the throne? What would this grand fête be should his genius fail, his powers prove unequal to the strain? King and prince, lord and lady might slumber, but Vatel must be up and alert. Fresh fish formed an essential part of the menu which he had laid out for the dining tables of the 3rd day. He had ordered them from every part of the coast. Would they come? Could the fates fail him now, at this critical moment of his life? The anxious chef went abroad to view the situation. His eyes lighted. A fisher boy had just arrived with 2 loads of fish, fresh brought from the coast. Vatel looked at them, and then gazed around with newly disturbed eyes. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice faltering. "That is all, sir," answered the boy, who knew nothing about the numerous orders. Vatel turned pale. All? These few fish all he had to offer his multitude of guests? Only a miracle could divide these so as to give a portion to each. He waited, despair slowly descending upon his heart. In vain his anxious wait. No more fish appeared. Vatel's anxiety was fast becoming despair. The disaster of the night before, to be followed by this terrible stroke, it was more than his artistic soul could bear. Disgrace had come upon him in its direst form. His reputation was at stake. He met Gourville, a wit and factotum of the court, and told him of his misfortune. "It is disgrace, ruin!" he cried. "I cannot survive it." Gourville heard him with merry laughter. To his light mind the affair seemed only a good joke. It was not so to Vatel. He sought his room and locked himself in. He was too soon, alas, too soon! For now fish are coming. Here, there, everywhere, the orders have been strictly obeyed. There is abundance for all purposes. The cooks receive them, and look for Vatel to give orders for their disposal. He is not to be seen. He went to his room, says Gourville. They repair thither, knock persistently, but in vain, and finding that no answer can be obtained, they break open the door and enter. A frightful spectacle meets their eyes. On the floor before them lies poor Vatel, in a pool of his own blood, pierced through the heart. In his ecstasy of despair at the non-arrival of the fish, he had fastened his sword in the door, and thrown himself upon its deadly point. Thrice he had done so, twice wounding himself slightly, the third time piercing himself through the heart. Poor fellow, he was dead, and the fish had arrived. It was a useful sacrifice of his life to his art. The tidings of the tragedy filled the château with alarm and dismay. The prince was in despair, the more so as the king blamed him for the fatal occurrence. He had long avoided Chantilly, he said, knowing that his coming would occasion inconvenience, since his host would insist on providing for the whole of his suite. There should have been but 2 tables, and there were more than 25. The strain on poor Vatel was the cause of his death, and the loss of one of the ornaments of the reign. He would never allow such extravagance again. Men like Vatel were not to be so lightly sacrificed. While the king thus petulantly scolded his great subject in the time-honoured "I told you so" fashion, the whole château buzzed with opinions about the tragic event. Vatel has played the hero, said some. He has played the idiot, said others. Some praised his courage and devotion to his art, others blamed his haste and folly. But praise prevailed over blame, for, as all conceded, he had died for the honour of his profession, and no soldier or martyr could do more. But Vatel was gone, and dinner was not served. The dead was dead, but appetite remained. What was to be done? Gourville sprang into the breach and undertook to replace Vatel. The fish were cooked, the company dined, then they promenaded, then they played piquet, losing and winning largely, then they supped, then they enjoyed a moonlight chase of the deer in the park of Chantilly. Mirth and gaiety prevailed, and before bedtime came, poor Vatel was forgotten. The cook who had died for his art was as far from their thoughts as the martyrs of centuries before. Early the next day the king and his train departed, leaving Condé to count the cost of the entertainment, which had been so great as to make him agree with Louis that hereafter 2 tables would be better than 25. Doubtless among his chief losses he counted Vatel. Money could be found again, waste repaired, but a genius of the kitchen, the equal of Vatel, was not to be had to order. Men like him are the growth of centuries. He died that his name might live. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. The Man with the Iron Mask. In the year of 1662, the first year of the absolute reign of Louis XIV., there occurred an event without parallel in history, and which still remains shrouded in the mystery in which it was from the first involved. There was sent with the utmost secrecy to the Château of Pignerol an unknown prisoner, whose identity was kept secret with the most extreme care. All that can be said of him is that he was young, well formed, and attractive in appearance, and above the usual stature. As for his face, whether it were handsome or ill-favoured, noble or base, no man could say, for it was concealed by an impenetrable mask, the lower portion of which was made movable by steel springs, so that he could eat with it on, while the upper portion was immovably fixed. This mysterious state prisoner remained for a number of years at Pignerol, under charge of its governor, M. de Saint-Mars, an officer of the greatest discretion and trustworthiness. He was afterwards removed to the castle of the Ile de Sainte Marguerite, on the coast of Provence, where he remained for years in the same mysterious seclusion, an object of the greatest curiosity on the part of all the people of the prison, and of no less interest to the people of the kingdom, to whose love of the marvellous the secrecy surrounding him appealed. The mask was never removed, day or night, so far as anyone could learn, while conjecture sought in vain to discover who this mysterious personage might be. This much was certain: no person of leading importance had disappeared from Europe in the year 1662. On the other hand, the masked prisoner was treated with a consideration which could be looked for only by persons of the highest birth. The Marquis of Louvois, Minister of War under the Grand Monarque, was said to have visited him at Sainte Marguerite, and to have treated him with the respect due to one of royal birth. He spoke to him standing, as to one far his superior in station, and showed him throughout the interview the greatest deference. In 1698, M. de Saint-Mars was made governor of the Bastille. He brought with him this mysterious masked prisoner, whose secret it was apparently not deemed advisable to entrust to a new governor of Sainte Marguerite. As to what took place on the journey, we have some interesting details in a letter from M. de Faumanoir, grand-nephew of Saint-Mars. In 1698, M. de Saint Mars exchanged the governorship of the islands, Sainte Marguerite and Saint Honat, for that of the Bastille. When he set out to enter on his new office, he stayed with his prisoner for a short time at part2, his estate. The mask arrived in a litter which preceded that of M. de Saint Mars. They were accompanied by several men on horseback. The peasants went out to meet their seigneur. M. de Saint Mars took his meals with this prisoner, who sat with his back towards the windows of the room, which looked into the courtyard. The peasants of whom I made inquiry could not see if he had his mask on when eating, but they observed that M. de Saint Mars, who sat opposite to him at table, had a pair of pistols beside his plate. They were attended by a single valet only, Antoine Roux, who took away the dishes set down to him in an antechamber, having first carefully shut the door of the dining room. When the prisoner crossed the courtyard, a black mask was always on his face. The extreme caution here indicated was continued until the prisoner reached the Bastille. With regard to his life in this fortress we are better informed, since it must be acknowledged that the record of his previous prison life is somewhat obscure. All that seems well established is that he was one of the 2 prisoners of the lower tower at Pignerol in 1681, that he was spoken of to Saint Mars as your ancient prisoner, and your prisoner of 20 years' standing, that in 1687 he was removed from Exilles to Sainte Marguerite with the same care and secrecy observed in the journey to the Bastille, his gaoler accompanying him to the new prison, and that throughout he was under the care of the relentless Saint Mars. Of the life of this remarkable state prisoner in the Bastille we have more detailed accounts. Du Junca, the chief turnkey of that prison, has left a journal, which contains the following entry. On Thursday, the 18th of September, 1698, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, M. de Saint Mars, the governor, arrived at the Bastille for the first time from the islands of Sainte Marguerite and Saint Honat. He brought with him in his own litter an ancient prisoner formerly under his care at Pignerol, and whose name remains untold. This prisoner was always kept masked, and was at first lodged in the Bassinière tower. I conducted him afterwards to the Bertaudière tower, and put him in a room which, by order of M. de Saint Mars, I had furnished before his arrival. Throughout the life of this mysterious personage in the Bastille, the secrecy which had so far environed him was rigidly observed. So far as is known, no one ever saw him without his mask. Aside from this and his detention, everything that could be was done to make his life enjoyable. He was given the best accommodation the Bastille afforded. Nothing that he desired was refused him. He had a strong taste for lace and linen of extreme fineness, and his wishes in this particular were complied with. His table was always served in the most elegant manner, while the governor, who frequently attended him, seldom sat in his presence. During his intervals of ailment he was attended by the old doctor of the Bastille, who, while often examining his tongue and parts of his body, never saw his face. He represents him as very finely shaped, and of somewhat brownish complexion, with an agreeable and engaging voice. He never complained, nor gave any hint as to who he was, and throughout his whole prison life no one gained the least clue to his identity. The only instance in which he attempted to make himself known is described by Voltaire, who tells us that while at Sainte Marguerite he threw out from the grated window of his cell a piece of fine linen and a silver plate on which he had traced some strange characters. This, however, is an unauthenticated story. The detention of this mysterious prisoner in the Bastille was not an extended one. He died in 1703. De Junca's journal tells the story of his death. On Monday, the 19th of November, 1703, the unknown prisoner, who had continually worn a black velvet mask, and whom M. de Saint Mars had brought with him from the island of Sainte Marguerite, died to-day at about 10 o'clock in the evening, having been yesterday taken slightly ill. He had been a long time in M. de Saint Mars's hands, and his illness was exceedingly trifling. There is one particular of interest in this record. The iron mask appears to have been really a mask of black velvet, the only iron about it being the springs which permitted the lower part to be lifted. The question now arises, who was the man with the iron mask? It is a question which has been long debated without definite conclusion. Chamillard was the last minister of Louis XIV who knew this secret. When he was dying, his son-in-law, Marshal de Feuillade, begged him on his knees to reveal the mystery. He begged in vain. Chamillard answered that it was a secret of state which he had sworn never to reveal, and he died with it untold. Voltaire, in his Age of Louis XIV, was the first to call special attention to this mystery, and since then numerous conjectures have been made as to who the iron mask really was. One writer has suggested that he was an illegitimate son of Anne of Austria, the queen mother. Another identifies him with a supposed twin brother of Louis XIV., whose birth Richelieu had concealed. Others make him the Count of Vermandois, an illegitimate son of Louis XIV., the Duke of Beaufort, a hero of the Fronde, the Duke of Monmouth, the English pretender of 1685, Fouquet, Louis's disgraced minister of finance, a son of Cromwell, the English protector, and various other wild and unfounded guesses. After all has been said, the identity of the prisoner remains unknown. Matthioli, a diplomatic agent of the Duke of Mantua, who was long imprisoned at Pignerol and at Sainte Marguerite, was for a long time generally thought to be the Iron Mask, but there is good reason to believe that he died in 1694. Conjecture has exhausted itself, and yet the identity of this strange captive remains a mystery, and is likely always to continue so. The fact that all the exalted personages of the day can be traced renders it probable that the veiled prisoner was really an obscure individual, whom the caprice of Louis XIV. Surrounded with conditions intended to excite the curiosity of the public. There are on record other instances of imprisonment under similar conditions of inviolate secrecy, and it is not impossible that the king might have endeavoured, for no purpose higher than whim, to surround the story of this one with unbroken mystery. If such were his purpose, it has succeeded, for there is no more mysterious person in history than the man with the Iron Mask. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Voltaire's Last Visit to Paris. Never had excitable Paris been more excited. Only one man was talked of, only one subject thought of. There was no longer interest in rumours of war, in political quarrels, in the doings at the king's court. All admiration and all sympathy were turned towards one feeble old man, who had returned to Paris to die. For 27 years he had been absent, that brilliant writer and unsurpassed genius, the versatile Voltaire. His facile pen had given its greatest glory to the reign of Louis XV., yet for more than a quarter of a century he had been exiled from the land he loved, because he dared to exercise the privilege of free speech in that land of oppression, and to deal with kings and nobles as man with man, not as reverent worshipper with divinity. Now, in his 84th year of age, he had ventured to come back to the city he loved above all others, with scarcely enough life left for the journey, and far from sure that power would not still seek to suppress genius as it had done in the past. If he had such fears, there was no warrant for them. Paris was ready to worship him. The king himself would not have dared to interfere with the popular idol in that interval of enthusiastic ebullition. All Paris was prepared to cast itself at his feet. All France was eager to do him honour. All calumny, jealousy, hatred were forgotten. A nation had risen to welcome and honour its greatest genius, and the splendours of the court paled before the glory which seemed to emanate from that feeble, tottering veteran of the empire of thought, who had come back to occupy, for a brief period, the throne of his old dominion. The admiration, the enthusiasm, the glory were too much for him. He was dying in the excitement of joy and triumph. Yet with his wonderful elasticity of frame and mind he rose again for a fuller enjoyment of that popular ovation which was to him the wine of life. The story of his final triumph has been so graphically told by an eye-witness that we cannot do better than to quote his words. Monsieur de Voltaire has appeared for the first time at the Academy and at the play. He found all the doors, all the approaches to the Academy besieged by a multitude which only opened slowly to let him pass, and then rushed in immediately upon his footsteps with repeated plaudits and acclamations. The Academy came out into the first room to meet him, an honour it had never yet paid to any of its members, not even to the foreign princes who had deigned to be present at its meetings. The homage he received at the Academy was merely the prelude to that which awaited him at the National Theatre. As soon as his carriage was seen at a distance, there arose a universal shout of joy. All the curbstones, all the barriers, all the windows were crammed with spectators, and scarcely was the carriage stopped when people were already on the imperial and even on the wheels to get a nearer view of the divinity. Scarcely had he entered the house when Sieur Brizard came up with a crown of laurels, which Madame de Villette placed upon the great man's head, but which he immediately took off, though the public urged him to keep it on, by clapping of hands and by cheers which resounded from all parts of the house with such a din as was never heard. All the women stood up. I saw at one time that part of the pit which was under the boxes go down on their knees in despair of getting a sight any other way. The whole house was darkened with the dust raised by the ebb and flow of the excited multitude. It was not without difficulty that the players managed at last to begin the piece. It was Irene which was given for the 6th time. Never had this tragedy been better played, never less listened to, never more applauded. The illustrious old man rose to thank the public, and a moment afterwards there appeared on a pedestal in the middle of the stage a bust of this great man, and the actresses, garlands and crowns in hand, covered it with laurels. Monsieur de Voltaire seemed to be sinking beneath the burden of age and of the homage with which he had just been overwhelmed. He appeared deeply affected. His eyes still sparkled amidst the pallor of his face, but it seemed as if he breathed no longer save with the consciousness of his glory. The people shouted, "Lights, lights, that everybody may see him!" The coachman was entreated to go at a walk, and thus he was accompanied by cheering and the crowd as far as Pont Royal. This was a very different greeting from that which Voltaire had received 50 years before, when a nobleman with whom he had quarrelled had him beaten with sticks in the public street, and when Voltaire showed an intention of making him answer at the sword's point for this outrage, had him seized and thrown into the Bastille by the authorities. This was but one of the several times he had been immured in this gloomy prison for daring to say what he thought about powers and potentates. But time brings its revenge. The Chevalier de Rohan, who had had the poet castigated, was forgotten except as the man who had dishonoured himself in seeking to dishonour Voltaire, and the poet had become the idol of the people of Paris, high and low alike. Voltaire was not the only great man in Paris at this period. There was another as great as he, but great in a very different fashion. Benjamin Franklin, the American philosopher and statesman, as famous for common sense and public spirit as Voltaire was for poetical power and satirical keenness. These two great men met, and their meeting is worthy of description. The American envoys had asked permission to call on the veteran of literature, a request that was willingly granted when Voltaire learned that Franklin was one of the number. What passed between them may be briefly related. They found the aged poet reclining on a couch, thin of body, wrinkled of face, evidently sick and feeble, yet his eyes, glittering like two carbuncles, showed what spirit lay within his withered frame. As they entered, he raised himself with difficulty, and repeated the following lines from Thomson's Ode to Liberty, a poem which he had been familiar with in England 50 years before. Lo! swarming southward on rejoicing suns, gay colonies extend, the calm retreat of undisturbed distress, the better home of those whom bigots chase from foreign lands, not built on rapine, servitude, and woe, and in their turn some petty tyrant's prey, but bound by social freedom, firm they rise. He then began to converse with Franklin in English, but on being asked by his niece to speak in French, that she and the others present might understand what was said, he remarked, "I beg your pardon, I have for the moment yielded to the vanity of showing that I can speak in the language of a Franklin." Shortly afterwards Dr. Franklin presented him his grandson, whereupon the old man lifted his hands over the head of the youth and said, "My child, God and liberty, recollect those two words." This was not the only scene between Franklin and Voltaire. Another took place at the Academy of Sciences at one of the meetings of that body. The two distinguished guests sat side by side on the platform, in full view of the audience. During the proceedings an interruption occurred. A confused cry arose, the names of the two great visitors alone being distinguishable. It was taken to mean that they should be introduced. This was done. They rose and acknowledged the courtesy by bowing and a few words. But such a formal proceeding was far from enough to satisfy the audience. The noise continued. Franklin and Voltaire shook hands, they gave rise to plaudits, but the confused cries were not stilled. The audience wanted some more decided demonstration. "Il faut s'embrasser à la Françoise!" You must embrace in French fashion, they cried. John Adams, who witnessed the spectacle, thus describes what followed. The two aged actors upon this great theatre of philosophy and frivolity embraced each other by hugging one another in their arms and kissing each other's cheeks, and then the tumult subsided, and the cry immediately spread through the whole kingdom, and I suppose over all Europe, how charming it was to see Solon and Sophocles embrace. A month later Voltaire lay dead, his brilliant eyes closed, his active brain at rest. The excitement of his visit to Paris and the constant ovation which he had received had been too much for the old man. He had died in the midst of his triumph, vanished from the stage of life just when his genius had compelled the highest display of appreciation which it was ever possible for his countrymen to give. As for the Church, which his keen pen had dealt with as severely as with the temporal powers, it could not well forget his incessant and bitter attacks. That he might obtain Christian burial, he confessed and received absolution from the Abbé Gautier, but with his views this was simply a sacrifice to the proprieties. He remained a heathen poet to the end, a born satirist and scoffer at all tradition and all conventionality. Voltaire was deistic in belief, in no sense atheistic. Among his latest words were, "I die worshipping God, loving my friends, not hating my enemies, but detesting superstition." Despite the admiration of the people, the powers of the state could not forget that the man so enthusiastically received was the great apostle of mockery and irreverence. The government gave its last kick to the dead lion by ordering the papers not to comment on his death. The Church laid an interdict on his burial in consecrated ground, an hour or two too late, as it proved. His body, minus the heart, was transferred in 1791 to the Pantheon, and when, in 1864, the sarcophagus was opened with the purpose of restoring the heart to the other remains, it was found to be empty. In the stirring days of France the body had by someone, in some way, been removed. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25 The Diamond Necklace. Paris, that city of sensations, was shaken to its centre by tidings of a new and startling event. The Cardinal de Rohan, Grand Almoner of France, at mass time, and when dressed in his pontifical robes, had been suddenly arrested in the palace of Versailles and taken to the Bastille. Why? No one knew, though many had their opinions and beliefs. Rumours of some mysterious and disgraceful secret beneath this arrest, a mystery in which the honour of Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, was involved, had got afloat, and were whispered from end to end of the city, in which the Austrian, as the Queen was contemptuously designated, was by no means a favourite. The truth gradually came out, the story of a disgraceful and extraordinary intrigue, of which the Prince Cardinal was a victim rather than an accessory, and of which the Queen was utterly ignorant, though the odium of the transaction clung to her until her death. When, 8 years afterwards, she was borne through a raging mob to the guillotine, insulting references to this affair of the diamond necklace were among the terms of opprobrium heaped upon her by the dregs of the Parisian populace. What was this disgraceful business? It is partly revealed in the graphic account of an interview with the king, which preceded the arrest of the Prince Cardinal. On the 15th of August, 1785, Louis XVI. Sent for M. de Rohan to his cabinet. He entered smilingly, not dreaming of the thunderbolt that was about to burst upon his head. He found there the king and queen, the former with indignant countenance, the latter grave and severe in expression. "Cardinal," broke out the king in an abrupt tone, "you bought some diamonds of Burmer?" "Yes, sir," rejoined the cardinal, disturbed by the stern severity of the king's looks and tone. "What have you done with them?" "I thought they had been sent to the queen." "Who gave you the commission to buy them?" "A lady, the Countess de la Motte Valois," answered the cardinal, growing more uneasy. "She gave me a letter from the queen. I thought I was obliging her majesty." The queen sharply interrupted him. She was no friend of the cardinal. He had maligned her years before, when her husband was but Dauphin of France. Now was the opportunity to repay him for those malevolent letters. "How, sir?" she broke out severely. "How could you think, you to whom I have never spoken for 8 years, that I should choose you for conducting such a negotiation, and by the medium of such a woman?" "I was mistaken, I perceive," said the cardinal humbly. "The desire I felt to please your majesty misled me. Here is the letter which I was told was from you." He drew a letter from his pocket and handed it to the king. Louis took it and cast his eyes over the signature. He looked up indignantly. "How could a prince of your house and my grand almoner suppose that the queen would sign Marie Antoinette of France?" he sternly demanded. "Queens do not sign their names at such length. It is not even the queen's writing. And what is the meaning of all these doings with jewellers, and these notes shown to bankers?" By this time the cardinal was so agitated that he was obliged to rest himself against the table for support. "Sir," he said, in a broken voice, "I am too much overcome to be able to reply. What you say overwhelms me with surprise." "Walk into the room, Cardinal," said the king, with more kindness of tone. "You may write your explanation of these occurrences." The cardinal attempted to do so, but his written statement failed to make clear the mystery. In the end, an officer of the king's bodyguard was called in, and an order given him to convey Cardinal de Rohan to the Bastille. He had barely time to give secret directions to his grand vicar to burn all his papers, before he was carried off to that frightful fortress, the scene of so much injustice, haunted by so many woes. The papers of de Rohan probably needed purging by fire, for the order to burn them indicates that they contained evidence derogatory to his position as a dignitary of the Church. The Prince Cardinal was a vain and profligate man, full of vicious inclinations, and credulous to a degree that had made him the victim of the unscrupulous schemer, Madame de la Motte Valois, a woman as adroit and unscrupulous as she was daring. Of low birth, brought up by charity, married to a ruined nobleman, she had ended her career by duping and ruining Cardinal de Rohan, a man whose character exposed him to the machinations of an adventuress so skilful, bold, and alluring as La Motte Valois. So much for preliminary. Let us take up the story at its beginning. The diamond necklace was an exceedingly handsome and highly valuable piece of jewellery, containing about 500 diamonds, and held at a price equal to about $400,000 of modern money. It had been made by Boehmer, a jeweller of Paris, about the year 1774, and was intended for Madame du Barry, the favourite of Louis XV. But before the necklace was finished, Louis had died, and a new king had come to the throne. With Louis XVI. Virtue entered that profligate court, and Madame du Barry was excluded from its precincts. As for the necklace, it remained without a purchaser. It was too costly for a subject, and was not craved by the queen. The jeweller had not failed to offer it to Marie Antoinette, but found her disinclined to buy. The American Revolution was going on, France was involved in the war, and money was needed for other purposes than diamond necklaces. "That is the price of 2 frigates," said the king, on hearing of the estimated value of the famous trinket. "We want ships and not diamonds," said the queen, and ended the audience with the jeweller. A few months afterwards, M. Boehmer openly declared that he had found a purchaser for the necklace. It had gone to Constantinople, he said, for the adornment of the favourite sultana. This was a real pleasure to the queen, says Madame Campan. She, however, expressed some astonishment that a necklace made for the adornment of French women should be worn in the seraglio, and thereupon she talked to me a long time about the total change which took place in the tastes and desires of women in the period between 20 and 30 years of age. She told me that when she was 10 years younger she loved diamonds madly, but that she had no longer any taste for anything but private society, the country, the work, and the attentions required by the education of her children. From that moment until the fatal crisis there was nothing more said about the necklace. The necklace had not been sold. It remained in the jeweller's hands until nearly 10 years had passed. Then the vicious de la Motte laid an adroit plan for getting it into her possession, through the aid of the Cardinal de Rohan, who had come to admire her. She was a hanger-on of the court, and began her work by persuading the cardinal that the queen regarded him with favour. The credulous dupe was completely infatuated with the idea. One night in August, 1784, he was given a brief interview in the groves around Versailles with a woman whom he supposed to be the queen, but who was really a girl resembling her, and taught by La Motte to play this part. Filled with the idea that the queen loved him, the duped cardinal was ready for any folly. De la Motte played her next card by persuading him that the queen had a secret desire to possess this wonderful necklace, but had not the necessary money at that time. She would, however, sign an agreement to purchase it if the cardinal would become her security. De Rohan eagerly assented. This secret understanding seemed but another proof of the queen's predilection for him. An agreement was produced, signed with the queen's name, to which the cardinal added his own, and on February 1st, 1785, the jeweller surrendered the necklace to de Rohan, receiving this agreement as his security. The cardinal carried the costly prize to Versailles, where he was told the queen would send for it. It was given by him to La Motte, who was commissioned to deliver it to her royal patroness. In a few days afterwards, this lady's husband disappeared from Paris, and the diamond necklace with him. The whole affair had been a trick. All the messages from the queen had been false ones, the written documents being prepared by a seeming valet, who was skilful in the imitation of handwriting. Throughout the whole business the cardinal had been readily deceived, infatuation closing his eyes to truth. Such was the first act in the drama. The second opened when the jeweller began to press for payment. Monsieur de la Motte sold some of the diamonds in England, and transmitted the money to his wife, who is said to have quieted the jeweller for a time by paying him some instalments on the price. But he quickly grew impatient and suspicious that all was not right, and went to court, where he earnestly inquired if the necklace had been delivered to the queen. For a time she could not understand what he meant. The diamond necklace? What diamond necklace? What did this mean? The Cardinal de Rohan her security for payment? It was all false, all base, some dark intrigue behind it all. Burning with indignation, she sent for Abbé de Vermont and Baron de Breteuil, the minister of the king's household, and told them of the affair. It was a shameful business, they said. They hated the cardinal, and did not spare him. The queen, growing momentarily more angry, at length decided to reveal the whole transaction to the king, and roused in his mind an indignation equal to her own. The result we have already seen. De Rohan and La Motte were consigned to the Bastille. Monsieur de la Motte was in England, and thus out of reach of justice. Another celebrated individual who was concerned in the affair, and had aided in duping the cardinal, the famous or infamous Count Cagliostro, was also consigned to the Bastille for his share in the dark and deep intrigue. The trial came on, as the closing act in this mysterious drama, in which all Paris had now become intensely interested. The cardinal had renounced all the privileges of his rank and condition, and accepted the jurisdiction of Parliament, perhaps counting on the open enmity between that body and the court. The trial revealed a disgraceful business, in which a high dignitary of the Church had permitted himself to be completely gulled by a shameless woman and the equally shameless Cagliostro, and into which not only the name but even the virtue of the queen had been dragged. Public opinion became intense. The hostility to the queen, which had long smouldered, now openly declared itself. It was for her and by her orders that the necklace was bought, said the respectable Parisians. Those who were not respectable said much worse things. The queen was being made a victim of these shameless and criminal adventurers. The trial went on, political feeling being openly displayed in it. The great houses of Condé and Rohan took sides with the cardinal. Their representatives might be seen, dressed in mourning, interviewing the magistrates on their way to the tribunal, pleading with them on behalf of their relative. The magistrates needed little persuasion. The Parliament of Paris had long been at sword's point with the crown. Now was its time for revenge. Political prejudice blinded the members to the pure questions of law and justice. The cardinal was acquitted. Cagliostro was similarly acquitted. He had conducted his own case, and with a skill that deceived the magistrates and the public alike. Madame de la Motte alone was convicted. She was sentenced to be whipped, branded on each shoulder with the letter V for voleuse, thief, and to be imprisoned for life. Her husband, who was in England, was sentenced in his absence to the galleys for life. A minor participant in this business, the girl who had personated the queen, escaped unpunished. So ended this disgraceful affair. The queen was greatly cast down by the result. "Condole with me," she said, in a broken voice, to Madame Campan. "The intriguer who wanted to ruin me, or procure money by using my name and forging my signature, has just been fully acquitted." But it was due, she declared, to bribery on the part of some, and to political passion on that of others, with an audacity towards authority which such people love to display. The king entered as she was speaking. "You find the queen in great affliction," he said to Madame Campan. "She has much reason to be. But what then? They would not see in this business anything save a prince of the Church and the Prince of Rohan, whereas it is only the case of a man in want of money and a mere trick for raising cash, wherein the cardinal has been swindled in his turn. Nothing is easier to understand, and it needs no Alexander to cut this Gordian knot." Cardinal Rohan was exiled to his abbey of Chaise-Dieu, guilty in the king's opinion, a dupe in the judgment of history, evidently a credulous profligate who had mistaken his vocation. The queen was the true victim of the whole affair. It doubled the hostility of the people to her, and had its share in that final sentence which brought her head to the block. End of Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26 The Fall of the Bastille. "To the Bastille! To the Bastille!" was the cry. Paris surged with an ungovernable mob. Month by month, week by week, day by day, since the meeting of the States General, called into being chiefly to provide money for the king, and kept in being to provide government for the people, the revolutionary feeling had grown, alike among the delegates and among the citizens. Now the population of Paris was aroused, the unruly element of the city was in the streets, their wrath directed against the prison fortress, the bulwark of feudalism, the stronghold of oppression, the infamous keeper of the dark secrets of kings of France. The people had always feared, always hated it, and now against its sullen walls was directed the torrent of their wrath. The surging throng besieged the Hôtel de Ville, demanding arms. Gaining no satisfaction there, they rushed to the Invalides, where they knew that arms were stored. The governor wished to parley. "He asks for time to make us lose ours," cried a voice in the crowd. A rush was made, the iron gates gave way, the cellar doors were forced open, and in a short time 30,000 guns were distributed among the people. Minute by minute the tumult increased. Messengers came with threatened tidings. The troops are marching to attack the faubourgs. Paris is about to be put to fire and sword. The cannon of the Bastille are about to open fire upon us, were the startling cries. The people grew wild with rage. This scene was the first of those frightful outbreaks of mob violence of which Paris was in the coming years to see so many. It was the 14th of July, 1789. As yet no man dreamed of the horrors which the near future was to bring forth. The Third Estate was at war with the king, and fancied itself the power in France. But beneath it, unseen by it, almost undreamed of by it, was rousing from sleep the wild beast of popular fury and revenge. Centuries of oppression were about to be repaid by years of a wild carnival of slaughter. The Bastille was the visible emblem of that oppression. It was an armed fortress threatening Paris. The cannon on its wall frowned defiance to the people. Momentarily the wrath of the multitude grew stronger. The electors of the Third Estate sent a message to Delaunay, governor of the Bastille, asking him to withdraw the cannons, the sight of which infuriated the people, and promising, if he would do this, to restrain the mob. The advice was wise, the governor was not. The messengers were long absent, the electors grew uneasy. The tumult in the street increased. At length the deputation returned, bringing word that the governor pledged himself not to fire on the people, unless forced to do so in self-defence. This message the electors communicated to the crowd along the Hôtel de Ville, hoping that it would satisfy them. Their words were interrupted by a startling sound, the roar of a cannon. Even while they were reporting the governor's evasive message, the cannon of the Bastille were roaring defiance to the people of Paris. An attack had been made by the people on the fortress, and this was the governor's response. That shot was fatal to Delaunay. The citizens heard it with rage. "Treason!" was the cry. "To the Bastille! To the Bastille!" again rose the shout. Surging onward in an irresistible mass, the furious crowd poured through the streets, and soon surrounded the towering walls of the detested prison fortress. A few bold men had already cut the chains of the first drawbridge, and let it fall. Across it rushed the multitude to attack the second bridge. The fortress was feebly garrisoned, having but 30 Swiss soldiers and 80 invalids for its defence. But its walls were massive, it was well provided, it had resisted many attacks in the past. This disorderly and badly armed mass seemed likely to beat in vain against those century-old bulwarks and towers. Yet there come times in which indignation grows strong, even with bare hands, oppression waxes weak behind its walls of might, and this was one of those times. A chance shot was fired from the crowd. The soldiers answered with a volley. Several men were wounded. Other shots came from the people. The governor gave orders to fire the cannon. The struggle had begun. It proved a short one. Companies of the National Guard were brought up to restrain the mob. The soldiers broke from their ranks and joined it. Two of their sub-officers, Élie and Hulin by name, put themselves at the head of the furious crowd and led the people to the assault on the fortress. The fire of the garrison swept through their dense ranks. Many of them fell. 150 were killed or wounded, but now several pieces of cannon were dragged up by hand, and their threatening muzzles turned against the gates. The assault was progressing. Delaunay waited for succour which did not arrive. The small garrison could not withstand that mighty mob. In the excitement of the moment, the governor attempted to blow up the powder magazine, and would have done so, had not one of his attendants held his arms by force. And now deputations arrived from the electors, 2 of them in succession, demanding that the fortress should be given up to the citizen guard. Delaunay proposed to capitulate, saying that he would yield if he and his men were allowed to march out with arms and honour. The proposition was received with shouts of sarcastic laughter. "Life and safety are all we can promise you," answered Élie. "This I engage on the word of an officer." Delaunay, at this, ordered the second drawbridge to be lowered and the gates to be opened. In poured the masses, precipitating themselves in fury upon that hated fortress, rushing madly through all its halls and passages, breaking its cell doors with hammer blows, releasing captives, some of whom had been held there in hopeless misery for half a lifetime, unearthing secrets which added to their revengeful rage. Élie and Hulin had promised the governor his life. They miscalculated their power over their savage followers. Before they had gone far they were fighting hand to hand with the multitude for the safety of their prisoner. At the Place de Grève, Hulin seized the governor in his strong arms and covered his bare head with a hat, with the hope of concealing his features from the people. In a moment more he was hurled down and trodden under foot, and on struggling to his feet saw the head of Delaunay carried on a pike. The major and lieutenant were similarly massacred. Flesselles, the mayor of Paris, shared their fate. The other prisoners were saved by the soldiers, who surrounded and protected them from the fury of the mob. The fall of the Bastille was celebrated by two processions that moved through the streets, one bloodstained and horrible, carrying the heads of the victims on pikes, the other triumphant and pathetic, bearing on their shoulders the prisoners released from its cells. Of these, two had been incarcerated so long that they were imbecile, and no one could tell whence they came. On the pathway of this procession flowers and ribbons were scattered. The spectators looked on with silent horror at the other. Meanwhile the king was at Versailles, in ignorance of what was taking place at Paris. The court were full of soldiers, drinking and singing. Wine had been distributed among them. There were courtiers and court intrigues still. The lowering cloud of ruin had yet scarcely cast a shadow on the palace. Louis XVI. Went to bed and to sleep, in blissful ignorance of what had taken place. The Duke of Liancourt entered and had him awakened, and informed him of the momentous event. "But that is a revolt!" exclaimed the king, with startled face, sitting up on his couch. "No, sire," replied the duke, "it is a revolution." That was the true word. It was a revolution. With the taking of the Bastille, the Revolution of France was fairly inaugurated. As for that detested fortress, its demolition began on the next day, amid the thunder of cannon and the singing of the Te Deum. It had dominated Paris and served as a state prison for 400 years. Its site was henceforward to be kept as a monument to liberty. End of Chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. The Story of the Sainte Ampoule. Sad years were they for kings and potentates in France, now a century ago, when the cup of civilization was turned upside down, and the dregs rose to the top. For once in the history of mankind the anarchist was lord, and a frightful use he made of his privileges. Not only living kings were at discount, but the very bones of kings were scattered to the winds, and the sacred oil, the Sainte Ampoule, which for many centuries had been used at the coronation of the kings of France, became an object of detestation, and was treated with the same lack of ceremony and consideration as the royal family itself. Thereby hangs a tale. But before telling what desecration came to the Sainte Ampoule through the impious hands of the new lords of France, it may be well to trace briefly the earlier history of this precious oil. Christianity came to France when Clovis, its first king, was baptized. And although we cannot say much for the Christian virtues of the worthy King Clovis, we are given to understand that heaven smiled on his conversion, for the story goes that a dove came down from the realm of the blessed, bearing a small vial of holy oil, which was placed in the hands of Saint Remi to be used in anointing the king at his coronation. Afterwards the saint placed this vial in his own tomb, where it was after many years discovered by miracle. It is true, Saint Remi tells us none of this. Our authority for it is Hincmar, Archbishop of Rheims, who flourished 4 centuries after Clovis and his converter had been gathered to their fathers. But as Hincmar defied those who doubted the story of the dove and the vial to prove the contrary, and produced a vial of oil from the saint's tomb in further proof of his statement, no reasonable person at that day could longer deny it, though the first mention of it is by a chronicler who lived a century and a half after the saint. From the days of Hincmar forward the monarchs of France at their coronation were anointed with this holy oil. And as the dove was said to have descended at Rheims, and Saint Remi was buried there, this became the city of the coronation. An order of knighthood was founded to take part in the coronation, the Knights of the Saint Ampoule, but the worthy incumbents held their office for a day only, that of the crowning of the king. They were created for that purpose, received the precious vial from the archbishop, and after the ceremony returned it to that high dignitary of the church, and saw it restored to its abiding place. This done, they ceased to exist as Knights of the Holy Oil, the order dying while the king lived. But these short-lived chevaliers made the most of their opportunity, and crowded all the splendour and dignity into their one day that it would well bear. The sacred vial was kept in the abbey of Saint Remy, and from that place to the cathedral they moved in a stately procession that almost threw the cortège of the king into the shade. The Grand Prior of Saint Remy bore the vial in its case or shrine, which hung from his neck by a golden chain. He rode always on a white horse, being covered by a magnificent canopy upheld by the Knights of the Saint Ampoule. The cathedral reached, the prior placed the vial in the hands of the archbishop, who pledged himself by a solemn oath to restore it at the end of the ceremony. And to make this doubly sure, a number of barons were given to the knights as hostages, the restoration of the vial to be their ransom. The ceremony over, back to the abbey they went, through streets adorned with rich tapestries, and surrounded by throngs of admiring lookers-on, to whom the vial was as of much interest as the king's crown. For many centuries this honour came at intervals to the city of Rheims, and the Saint Remy vial figured as an indispensable element of every kingly coronation. It figured thus in the mission of Joan of Arc, whose purpose was to drive the English from Orleans and open the way to Rheims, that the new king might be crowned with the old ceremony. The holy oil continued to play a leading part in the coronation of the kings until the reign of Louis XVI. Then came the Revolution, that mighty overturner of all things sacred and time-honoured, and a new chapter was written in the story of the Saint Ampoule. It is this chapter which we have now to give. The Revolution had gone on, desecrating things sacred and beheading things royal, through years of terror, and now had arrived the 6th of October, 1793, a day fatal in the history of the holy oil. On that day, Citizen Roule, one of the new sovereigns of France, entered the room of Philippe Aurel, chief margouillier of the cathedral of Rheims, and demanded of him the vial of coronation oil of which he had charge. Horror seized Monsieur Philippe, but Master Roule was imperative, and the guillotine stood in the near perspective. There was nothing to do but to obey. "It is not in my care," declared the trembling Philippe. "It is in the keeping of the curé, Monsieur Sérène. I will instantly apply to him for it." "And make haste," said Citizen Roule. "Bring pomatum and all," thus irreverently designated the age-thickened oil. "May I ask what you will do with it?" ventured Philippe. "Grease the knife of the guillotine, mayhap, that it may the easier slip through your neck if you waste any time in your errand." As may be imagined, Philippe Aurel lost no time in seeking the curé, and giving him his startling message. Monsieur Sérène heard him with horror. Had the desecration of the sans-culottism proceeded so far as this? But an idea sprang to the quick wit of the curé. "We can save some of it," he exclaimed. A minute sufficed to extract a portion of the unguent-like substance. Then, with a sigh of regret, the curé handed the vial to Philippe, who, with another sigh of regret, delivered it to Citizen Roule, who, without a sigh of regret, carried it to the front of the cathedral, and at the foot of the statue of Louis XV. Hammered the vial to powder, and trod what remained of the precious ointment under foot until it was completely mingled with the mud of the street. "So we put an end to princes and pomatum," said this irascible republican, with a laugh of triumph, as he ground the remnants of the vial under his irreverent heel. Not quite an end to either, as it proved. The portions of the sacred oil which Monsieur Sérène had saved was divided into two portions, one kept by himself, the other placed in the care of Philippe Aurel, to be kept until the reign of anarchy should come to an end, and a king reign again in France. And had Citizen Roule dreamed of all that lay in the future, every hair on his democratic head would have stood erect in horror and dismay. In truth, not many years had passed before the age of princes came again to France, and a demand for Saint Remy's vial arose. Napoleon was to be crowned emperor at Notre Dame. Little did this usurper of royalty care for the holy oil, but there were those around him with more reverence for the past, men who would have greatly liked to act as knights of the Saint Ampoule. But the unguent was not forthcoming, and the emperor was crowned without its aid. Then came the end of the imperial dynasty and the return of the Bourbons. To them the precious ointment was an important essential of legitimate kingship. Could Saint Remy's vial be found, or had it and its contents vanished in the whirlpool of the Revolution? That was to be learned. A worthy magistrate of Reims, Monsieur de Chevrières, took in hand the task of discovery. He searched diligently but unsuccessfully until one day in the early months of 1819, when three gentlemen, sons of Philippe Aurel, called upon him and told the story which we have just transcribed. A portion of the holy oil of coronation, they declared, had been in their father's care, preserved and transmitted through Monsieur Serenne's wit and promptitude. Their father was dead, but he had left it to his widow, who long kept it as a priceless treasure. They were interrupted at this point in their story by Monsieur de Chevrières. "This is fortunate," he exclaimed. "She must pass it over to me. Her name will become historic for her loyal spirit." "I wish she could," said one of the visitors, "but alas! it is lost. Our house was plundered during the invasion, and among other things taken was this precious relic. It is irretrievably gone." That seemed to end the matter. But not so. There was more of the consecration oil in existence than could have been imagined. The visit of the Aurels was followed after an interval by a call from Judge Leconte, who brought what he affirmed was a portion of the holy ointment which had been given him by the widow Aurel. Unluckily it was of microscopic dimensions, far from enough to impart the full flavour of kingship to his Majesty Louis XVIII. It seemed as if this worthy monarch of the Restoration would have to wear his crown without anointment, when fortunately a new and interesting item of news was made public. It was declared by a number of ecclesiastics that the curé, Monsieur Serenne, had given only a part of the oil to Philippe Aurel, and had himself kept the remainder. He had told them so, but as it proved, not a man of them all knew what he had done with it. He had died, and the secret with him. Months passed away, spring vanished, summer came, then new tidings bloomed. A priest of Berry au Bac, Monsieur Boré by name, sought Monsieur de Chevrières, and gladdened his heart with the announcement that the missing relic was in his possession, having been consigned to him by Monsieur Serenne. It was rendered doubly precious by being wrapped in a portion of the winding sheet of the blessed Saint Remy himself. Nor was this all. Within a week another portion of the lost treasure was brought forward. It had been preserved in a manner almost miraculous. Its possessor was a gentleman named Monsieur Champagne Provotien, who had the following interesting story to tell. He had a quarter of a century before, in 1793, been standing near Citizen Rueil, when that scion of the Revolution destroyed the vial of Saint Remy at the foot of the statue of Louis XV., in front of the cathedral of Reims. When he struck the vial he did so with such force that fragments of it flew right and left, some of them falling on the coat sleeve of the young man beside him, Monsieur Champagne. These he dexterously concealed from the iconoclastic citizen, took home, and preserved. He now produced them. Here were 3 separate portions of the precious ointment. A commission was appointed to examine them. They were pronounced genuine, oil and glass alike. Enough had been saved to crown a king. "There is nothing now to obstruct the coronation of your Majesty," said an officer of the court to Louis XVIII. His Majesty laughed incredulously. He was an unbeliever as regarded legend, and a democrat as regarded ceremony, and gave the gentleman to understand that he was content to reign without being anointed. "What shall be done with the ointment?" asked the disappointed official. "Lock it up in the vestry, and say no more about it," replied the king. This was done, and the precious relics were restored to the tomb of Saint Remy, whence they originally came, being placed there in a silver reliquary lined with white silk, and enclosed in a metal case with 3 locks. And there they lay until 1825, when a new king came to the throne in the person of Charles X. Now for the last time the old ceremony was revived, the Knights of the Saint Ampoule being created, and their office duly performed. With such dignity as he could assume, and such grandeur as he could display, Charles entered the choir of the cathedral and advanced to the grand altar, at whose foot he knelt. On rising, he was led to the centre of the sanctuary, and took his seat in a throne-like chair, placed there to receive him. In a semicircle round him stood a richly dressed group of nobles and courtiers. Then came forward in a stately procession the Chevalier of the Saint Ampoule, bearing the minute remnants of that sacred oil which was claimed to have been first used in the anointing of Clovis 1300 years before. An imposing group of churchmen stood ready to receive the ointment, including 3 prelates, an archbishop, and 2 bishops. These dignitaries carried the precious relic to the high altar, consecrated it, and anointed the king with a solemn ceremony highly edifying to the observers, and greatly gratifying to the vanity of the new monarch. It cannot be said that this ceremonious proceeding appealed to the people of France. It was the 19th century, and the Revolution lay between the new and the old age. All men of wit laughed at the pompous affair, and 5 years afterwards the people of Paris dispensed with Charles X. as their king, despite the flavour of coronation that hung about him. The dynasty of the Bourbons was at an end, and the Knights of the Saint Ampoule had been created for the last time. In conclusion, there is a story connected with the coronation ceremony which may be of interest. Legend or history tells us that at one time the English took the city of Rheims, plundered it, and as part of their plunder carried off the Saint Ampoule, which their desecrating hands had stolen from the tomb of Saint Remy. The people of the suburb of Chêne-la-Populeux pursued the invaders, fell upon them, and recovered this precious treasure. From that time, in memory of their deed, the inhabitants of Chêne claimed the right to walk in the procession of the Saint Ampoule, and to fall heir to the horse ridden by the Grand Prior. This horse was furnished by the government, and was claimed by the prior as the property of the abbey in recompense for his services. He denied the claim of the people of Chêne, said that their story was a fable, and that at the best they were but low-born rogues. As a result of all this, hot blood existed between the rival claimants to the white horse of the coronation. At the crowning of Louis XIV., the monks and the people of Chêne came to blows in support of their respective claims. The villagers pulled the prior from his horse, pommelled the monks who came to his aid, thrashed the knights out of every semblance of dignity, tore the canopy into shreds, and led off the white horse in triumph. Law followed blows, the cost of a dozen horses was wasted on the lawyers. In the end the monks won, and the people of Chêne had to restore the four-footed prize to the prior. At the subsequent coronations of Louis XV. And Louis XVI. They renewed their claim, and violence was again threatened. The trouble was overcome by special decrees, which prohibited the people of Chêne from meddling with the claim of the prior. By the time of the coronation of Charles X., all such mediaeval folly was at an end, and the stately old ceremony had become a matter of popular ridicule. The story of the Saint Ampoule is not without its interest in showing the growth of ideas. At the end of the 9th century a bishop could gravely state, and a nation unquestionably accept his statement, that a dove had flown down from heaven, bearing a vial of holy oil for the anointment of its kings. At the end of the 19th century the same nation has lost its last vestige of reverence for the divinity which doth hedge a king, and has no longer any use for divinely commissioned potentates, or heaven-sent ointments. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. The Flight of the King. At midnight of the 22nd of June, 1791, a heavy and lumbering carriage rolled slowly into the town of Varennes, situated in the department of Meuse, in northeastern France. It had set out from Paris at an early hour of the preceding day, and had now left that turbulent capital more than 150 miles behind it, pursuing a direct route towards the nearest frontier of the kingdom. There were in this clumsy vehicle several plainly dressed ladies, a man attired as a servant, and a half-grown boy. They all seemed in the best of spirits, and felicitated themselves on having come so far without question or obstruction. As they neared Varennes, however, an alarming sound was borne on the midnight air to their ears, that of a clanging bell, ringing quickly, as if in alarm. They entered the town, and drove to the post-house. "Let us have horses at once," was the demand of the outriders. "We must go forward without delay." "There are no horses ready," was the reply. "Have you your passports?" The papers were presented and taken to Monsieur Zos, the public officer of the commune, a timid little shopkeeper, sadly incompetent to deal with any matter that needed bold decision. He cast his eye over the passports, which shook in his trembling hand. Yet they appeared to be all right, being made out in the name of Baron Korff, the man in the carriage being named as a valet de chambre to the Baron. But the disturbed little commune officer knew better than that. A young man named Drouet, son of the postmaster at Saint-Ménehould, had, a half-hour or so before, ridden at furious speed into the town, giving startling information to such of the citizens as he found awake. There quickly followed that ringing of the alarm bell, which had pealed trouble into the ears of the approaching travellers. Monsieur Zos approached the carriage and bowed with the deepest respect before the seeming servant within. "Will you not enter my house?" he asked. "There is a rumour abroad that we are so fortunate as to have our king in our midst. If you remain in the carriage while the municipal authorities are in council, your Majesty might be exposed to insult." The secret was out. It was the King of France who was thus masquerading in the dress of a lackey, and speeding with all haste towards the frontier. The town was alarmed. A group of armed men stood at the shopkeeper's door as the traveller entered. Some of them told him rudely that they knew him to be the king. "If you recognize him," sharply answered the lady who followed, "speak to him with the respect you owe your king." It was Marie Antoinette, though her dress was rather that of a waiting maid than a queen. The ladies who followed her were Madame Elisabeth, the princess, and the governess of the royal children. The boy was the Dauphin of France. This flight had been undertaken under the management of General Bouillé, who had done all in his power to make it successful, by stationing relays of soldiers along the road, procuring passports, and other necessary details. But those entrusted with its execution had, aside from keeping the project a secret, clumsily managed its details. The carriage procured was of great size, and loaded like a furniture van with luggage. There was a day's delay in the start. Even the setting out was awkwardly managed, the queen leaving the place on foot, losing her way, and keeping her companions perilously waiting. The detachments of troops on the road were sure to attract attention. Careful precautions for the defeat of the enterprise seemed to have been taken. Yet all went well until Saint-Ménehould was reached, though the king was recognized by more than one person on the road. "We passed through the large town of Chalons-sur-Marne," wrote the young princess, "where we were quite recognized. Many people praised God at seeing the king, and made vows for his escape." All France had not yet reached the republican virulence of Paris. "All goes well, Francois," said the queen in a glad tone to Valory, her courier. "If we were to have been stopped, it would have taken place already." At Saint-Ménehould, however, they found the people in a different temper. The king was recognized, and though his carriage was not stopped, a detachment of dragoons, who had followed him at a distance, was not suffered to proceed, the people cutting the girths of the horses. Young Drouet, of whom we have already spoken, sprang on horseback and rode hurriedly on toward Varennes, preceding the carriage. The soldiers who had been posted at Varennes were in no condition to assist the king. The son of Marquis Bouet, who had accompanied the royal party, found them helplessly intoxicated, and rode off at full speed to inform his father of the alarming condition of affairs. Meanwhile the king, who had taken refuge in the shop of the grocer Zos, awaited the municipal authorities in no small perturbation of spirits. They presented themselves at length before him, bowing with great show of respect, and humbly asking his orders. "Have the horses put to my carriage without delay," he said, with no further attempt at concealment, "that I may start for Montmédy." They continued respectful, but were provided with various reasons why they could not obey. The horses were at a distance, those in the stables were not in condition to travel. Pretext after pretext was advanced for delay. In truth, no pretext was needed. The adjoining street was filled with armed revolutionists, and in no case would the carriage have been suffered to proceed. As daybreak approached, a detachment of dragoons rode into the town. They were those who had been posted near Chalons, and who had ridden on towards Montmédy after the king's passage. Missing him, they had returned. Choiseul, their commander, pushed through the people and entered the shop. "You are environed here," he said to the king. "We are not strong enough to take the carriage through, but if you will mount on horseback, we can force a passage through the crowd." "If I were alone, I should try it," said Louis. "I cannot do it as matters stand. I am waiting for daylight. They do not refuse to let me go on. Moreover, Monsieur de Bouet will soon be here." He did not recognize the danger of delay. The crowd in the streets was increasing. The bridge was barricaded. The authorities had sent a messenger in haste to Paris to tell what had happened and ask orders from the National Assembly. "Tell Monsieur de Bouet that I am a prisoner," said the king to Captain Delon, the commander of a detachment who had just reached him. "I suspect that he cannot do anything for me, but I desire him to do what he can." The queen, meanwhile, was urgently entreating Madame Zos to use her influence with her husband and procure an order for the king's release. She found the good woman by no means inclined to favour her. "You are thinking of the king," she said. "I am thinking of Monsieur Zos. Each is for her own husband." By this time the throng in the streets was growing impatient and violent. "To Paris! To Paris!" shouted the people. The king grew frightened. Bouillé had failed to appear. There was no indication of his approach. The excitement grew momentarily greater. During this anxious interval 2 officers rode rapidly up on the road from Paris, and presented themselves before the king. They were aides de camp of General Lafayette, commander of the National Guard. One of them, Romeuf by name, handed Louis a decree of the Assembly ordering pursuit and return of the king. It cited an act which forbade any public functionary to remove himself more than 20 leagues from his post. "I never sanctioned that," cried the king, angrily, flinging the paper on the bed where the Dauphin lay. The queen snatched it up hastily, exclaiming that the bed of her children should not be soiled by such a document. "Madame," said Romeuf warningly, "do you wish that other eyes than mine should witness your anger?" The queen blushed, and recovered with an effort the composure which she had suffered herself to lose. A messenger now arrived from Bouillé, bringing word that the detachments he had posted were moving toward Varennes, and that he himself was on the way thither. But the tumult in the streets had grown, hour by hour. The people were becoming furious at the delay. It seemed certain that the arrival of the troops would be the signal for a battle with the armed populace, who had strongly barricaded the town. Utterly disheartened, the king gave orders for the carriage. He had decided to return to Paris. An hour afterwards, Bouillé, breathless from a long and hurried ride, arrived within sight of Varennes. Its barricades met his eyes. He was told that the king had set out on his return an hour before. The game was up. Louis had lost his last hope of escape. The loyal general took the road for Stenay, and that same evening crossed the French frontier. The king's carriage made its way back to Paris through a throng that lined the roads, and which became dense when the city was reached. The National Guards held their arms reversed. None of the spectators uncovered their heads. The flight of the king had put an end to his authority and to the respect of the people. It was a sad procession that slowly made its way, in the evening light, along the boulevards towards the Tuileries. When the king and queen entered the palace, the doors were closed behind them, and armed guards stationed to prevent egress. The palace had become a prison. Louis XVI had ceased to reign. The National Assembly was now the governing power in France. What followed a few words may tell. In the succeeding year the Reign of Terror began, and Louis was taken from the Tuileries to the Temple, a true prison. In December he was tried for treason, and condemned to death, and on January 21st, 1793, his head fell under the knife of the guillotine. In October of the same year his unhappy queen shared his fate. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. The End of the Terror. No period of equal length in the whole era of history yields us such a succession of exciting and startling events as those few years between the convening of the States General in France and the rise of Napoleon to power, and particularly that portion of the Revolution known as the Reign of Terror. A volume of thrilling stories might have been made from its incidents alone, but it would have been a volume so full of tales of blood and woe, of misery and massacre, of the dominance of those wild beast passions which civilization seeks to subdue in man, that we may well be spared the telling. As with the fall of the Bastille began the long dominion of the populace, so with the fall of Robespierre it ended, and civil order returned to unhappy France. We have told the story of the one, we shall conclude with that of the other. 3 men dominated the Terror: Danton, Marat, and Robespierre. The first named best deserving the title of man, for he possessed certain qualities of manliness not shown by his brutal colleagues. As Lamartine says, nothing was wanting to make Danton a great man except virtue. He had too much manliness, as it seems, for the purposes of Robespierre, and was brought by him to the guillotine on April 5th, 1794. The triumvirate of the Reign of Terror was broken by his death and that of Marat, who had fallen under the avenging knife of Charlotte Corday in July, 1793. Robespierre was left sole director of the Revolution, being president of the Committee of Public Safety, leader of the Jacobin Club, favorite of the extreme Terrorists, and lord and master of the Convention, whose members were held in subjection by his violence and their fears. His dominion was not to be of long continuance. It was signalized by such a frightful activity of the guillotine, in which multitudes of innocent persons daily perished. that the terror which he produced was quickly followed by indignation, and a combination of many of the leading spirits of the Convention was formed against him. One after another he had vanquished all his enemies, and stood alone. But he stood on such a ghastly pyramid of the dead that he could not hope to maintain his dangerous elevation. The voice of vengeance, long choked by terror, at length began to rise against this wholesale executioner. The outbreak was precipitated by a demand of Saint Just, the most prominent supporter of Robespierre, that a dictatorship should be established in France, and that the virtuous and inflexible as well as incorruptible citizen Robespierre should be made dictator. It was a declaration of war. Many of the members of the Convention knew that it meant their death. Once give their terrible foe the extreme power which this demand indicated, and every known enemy of Robespierre in France would be doomed. Yet to oppose it was to oppose the Jacobins and the revolutionary sections, the controlling powers in Paris. The boldest members of the Convention might well pause and tremble before assailing their seemingly impregnable foe. But the rule of Robespierre had been opposed in committee. It had ceased to be a secret that he had enemies in the Convention. As yet the sentiment against him had spoken only in the dark, but the time was rapidly approaching when an open struggle could no longer be avoided. Robespierre himself began the battle. He said to a deputation from Aisne, "In the situation in which it is now, gangrened by corruption, and without power to remedy it, the Convention can no longer save the Republic. Both will perish together." He repeated this accusation before the Convention itself in a threatening speech, in which he declared that there was in its midst a conspiracy against public liberty. There were traitors in the national councils. The Convention must be purged and purified. The conspirators must be punished. His words were listened to in sullen silence. When he had ceased, no word was spoken except in whispers from member to member. The glove of defiance had been cast into their midst. Were there none among them with the courage to take it up, or must they all yield themselves as the slaves or the victims of this merciless autocrat? No, there were men of courage and patriotism left. 3 delegates rose simultaneously. 3 voices struggled for precedence in the right to attack the tyrant and dare the worst. "The man who has made himself master of everything, the man who paralyzes our will, is he who has just spoken, Robespierre," cried Cambon, in ringing tones of defiance. "It is Robespierre! It is Robespierre!" came from other unsealed voices. "Let him give an account of the crimes of the members whose death he demanded from the Jacobins." The attack was so unexpected and so vehement that Robespierre hesitated to reply. "You, who pretend to have the courage of virtue, have the courage of truth," cried Chaulier. "Name the individuals you accuse." Tumult and confusion followed these daring words. Robespierre, unable to gain the ear of the assembly, which now seemed filled with his enemies, and finding the feeling against him rapidly spreading, left the hall and took refuge with the Jacobins, where he repeated his address, this time to applauding hearers. Violent councils followed. Henriot, commandant of the troops, proposed to march on the Convention and put an end to its existence. "Name thy enemies," shouted the members to Robespierre, "we will deliver them to thee." Yet there was hesitation and doubt among the leaders. They feared the result of violent measures, and felt inclined to temporize and wait. The Convention met the next day. It met inspired with a new spirit. Courage animated the members. They had crossed the Rubicon and felt there was no return. During the interval since the last session, their forces had been organized, their plans considered. Saint Just appeared and sought to speak. He was interrupted, and his words drowned by the voices of indignant members. "I see here," cried Billaud Varennes, who stood beside him, "one of the men who, yesterday, at the Jacobins, promised the massacre of the National Convention. Let him be arrested." The officers obeyed this order. Saint Just was in custody. Billaud continued his remarks, declaring that the members were in danger of massacre, denouncing Robespierre and his supporters, bidding them to be firm and resolute. His boldness infected the assembly. The deputies stood up and waved their hats, shouting their approval. In the midst of this scene Robespierre appeared, livid with rage, his eyes flashing with the fury which inspired him. "I demand liberty to speak!" he exclaimed. "Down with the tyrant!" rose in a roar from 100 voices. Tallien, the leader of the opposition, sprang into the tribune. "I demand that the veil be torn away instantly!" he exclaimed. "The work is done. The conspirators are unmasked. Yesterday, at the Jacobins, I saw the army of the new Cromwell formed, and I have come here armed with a dagger to pierce his heart if the Assembly dares not decree his accusation. I demand the arrest of Henriot and his staff." The debate went on, growing more violent minute by minute. Several times Robespierre strove to speak, but each time his voice was drowned in cries of "Down with the tyrant!" Pale with rage and fear, he turned from his opponents toward his former supporters, both hands nervously clutching the tribune. "It is to you, pure and virtuous men," he said, "that I address myself. I do not talk with scoundrels." "Down with the tyrant!" was the response of the members addressed. Evidently the whole assembly had turned against him. Henriot, the president, rang his bell for order. "President of assassins!" cried Robespierre in a voice that grew feebler, "I once more demand liberty to speak." "The blood of Danton is choking him!" cried Garnier de Lode. "Shall this man longer remain master of the Convention?" asked Charles Duval. "Let us make an end! A decree! A decree!" shouted Lassault. "A tyrant is hard to strike down," exclaimed Fréron. Robespierre stood in the midst of his circle of enemies, assailed on all sides, nervously turning in his hands an open knife. "Send me to death!" he ejaculated. "You have merited it 1,000 times," cried his foes. "Down with the tyrant!" In the midst of the tumult a decree for his arrest was offered and carried. In it were included the names of his brother, of Couthon, and of Saint Just. Henriot proclaimed the decree, while wild acclamations of triumph shook the room. "Long live liberty! Long live the Republic! Down with the tyrants! To the bar with the accused!" came from the lips of those who the day before had not dared to speak. The floodgates were down, and the torrent of long repressed fury was rushing on the accused. The exciting scene ended in the removal of the prisoners, who were taken to separate prisons. Tidings of what had taken place in the Convention ran like wildfire through Paris. Thousands of households were inspired with hope. The Terrorists were filled with fury and dismay. The Commune and the Jacobins swore to support Robespierre. The tocsin peal rang out. The people gathered. The gates of Paris were closed. Henriot, half drunk, galloped along the streets crying out that the representatives of the people were being massacred. An insurrection against the Convention was rapidly organized, headed by desperate men, among them Robespierre himself, who was again free, having been taken from the hands of the officers. All was in peril. The Convention had assembled again, but had taken no steps in self-defense. Startling tidings were brought to the members in quick succession. It was said that the National Guard was coming with artillery to direct it against the hall. The roar of the insurrection filled street and building. For the time it looked as if Robespierre had conquered and all was at an end. "I propose," cried Élie Lacoste, "that Henriot be outlawed." As he spoke these words, the man named stood in the street without, ordering the artillerists, whose cannon were trained upon the Convention hall, to fire. The gunners hesitated. It was a critical moment. The fate of France hung in the balance. A group of the deputies came hastily from the hall and faced Henriot and his men. "What are you doing, soldiers?" they exclaimed. "That man is a rebel who has just been outlawed." The gunners lowered their matches. The Convention was saved. The National Guard had deserted Robespierre. Henriot put spurs to his horse and fled at full gallop. "Outlaw all who shall take arms against the Convention, or who shall oppose its decrees," said Barrère, "as well as those who have defied it by eluding arrest." This decree, repeated to the insurgents, completed their discomfiture. Rapidly they dispersed. Public opinion had changed. The Convention had triumphed. The gunners, who had marched with the insurrection, deserted their pieces, and a few hours afterwards returned to them to protect the Convention. The members of the Convention had run a serious risk in not taking active steps to assemble their friends, and in thus giving so perilous an opportunity to their enemies. This error was now retrieved. A section of their supporters came together, commanded by Léonard Bourdon and a gendarme named Mesdames. They reached the Hôtel de Ville without opposition. Mesdames entered it, crying, probably as a stratagem, "Long live Robespierre!" He reached the hall where the Jacobin leaders were gathered in silent dismay around the fallen dictator. Robespierre sat at a table, his head resting on his hand. Mesdames stepped toward him, pistols in hand. "Surrender, traitor!" he exclaimed. "It is you who are a traitor," retorted Robespierre, "and I will have you shot." His words were barely spoken when Mesdames fired, his bullet shattering Robespierre's lower jaw. It is well to state here, however, that in the belief of many Robespierre shot himself. This decided action created consternation in the room. The younger Robespierre leaped from a window, receiving mortal injury from the fall. Saint Just turned toward Lebas and said to him, "Kill me." "I have something better to do," answered Lebas, shooting himself through the head. A report from the stairway quickly followed. Mesdames with his second pistol had shot Couthon and badly wounded him. The hall had suddenly become a place of blood and death. The Jacobin chiefs, lately all powerful, now condemned, dead, or dying, presented a frightful spectacle. 2 days had changed the course of events in France. The reign of terror was at an end. Robespierre lay on a table, his head supported by a small deal box. The blood flowed slowly from his mouth. He was silent, giving no sign of pain or feeling. He was taken to the Conciergerie, whither other prisoners of his faction were being brought. Saint-Just and Couthon were already there. 5 o'clock came. The carts had drawn up as usual at the gate of the prison, waiting for the condemned. This time there was a new spectacle for the people, who had become wearied with executions, but were on the alert for the fresh sensation promised them. It was no time to temporize. The Convention had ordered the immediate execution of its foes. As Robespierre, with a blood-stained cloth round his face, entered the cart, there was a shout of joy and triumph from the assembled crowd. The late all-powerful man had not a friend left. On the scaffold the executioner tore the cloth from Robespierre's wounded face. A terrible cry of pain followed, the first sign of suffering he had given. In a minute more his head had fallen into the gory basket, and France was avenged. It was the 28th of July, 1794, less than 4 months after the death of Danton had left all the power in his hands. In that and the following days 103 executions sealed the fate of the defeated enemies of the Convention. Justice had been done. The terror was at an end. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30 The Burning of Moscow. From west to east across Europe had marched the army of the great conqueror, no nation daring to draw a hostile sword, none venturing to place an obstacle in its path. Across Russia it had marched almost as triumphantly, breaking irresistibly through the dams of armed men in its way, sweeping onward with the strength and majesty of fate. At length it had reached the heart of the empire of the Czars, and before it lay displayed the ancient capital of the Muscovite kings, time-honored Moscow. This great city was revealed to the eyes of the weary soldiers with the suddenness of a mirage in the desert. Throughout that day an interminable outreach of level country had seemed to spread before them, dreary, uninviting, disheartening. Now from the summit of the hill their triumphant eyes gazed suddenly upon the roofs and spires of a mighty city, splendid, far-reaching, stretching far across the plain that lay revealed before their eyes. It seemed to them truly as if the hand of a magician had touched the desert and caused this city to spring up across their path. It was a remarkable spectacle that met their gaze. Here were visible what seemed like hundreds of gilded domes and shining spires, thousands of habitations rich with varied colors, a strange compound of palaces and cottages, churches and bell towers, woods and lakes, Western and Oriental architecture, the Gothic arches and spires of Europe mingled with the strange forms of Byzantine and Asiatic edifices. Outwardly, a line of monasteries flanked with towers appeared to encircle the city. Centrally, crowning an eminence, rose a great citadel, from whose towers one could look down on columned temples and imperial palaces, embattled walls crowned with majestic domes, from whose summits, above the reversed crescent, rose the cross, Russia's emblem of conquest over the fanatical sectaries of the East. It was the Kremlin which they here beheld, the sacred center of the Russian Empire, the ancient dwelling-place and citadel of the Czars. A wild cry of wonder and triumph burst from the soldiers who had first reached the summit of the hill. "Moscow! Moscow!" they shouted, their imaginations strongly excited by the magnificent spectacle. This cry lent wings to those behind them. In crowding hosts the eager soldiers rushed up the long slope, all ranks mingling in their burning desire to gaze upon that great city which was the goal of their far-extended march. Deep were the emotions, intense the joy, with which they gazed on this dazzling vision, with all its domes and spires burning in the warm rays of the sun. Napoleon himself, who hastened to the spot, was struck with admiration, and new dreams of glory, doubtless, sprang up in his soul as he stood gazing with deep emotion on what must have seemed to him the key of the East, the gateway to conquests never yet surpassed by man. Little did he dream that it was ruin upon which he gazed, the fatal turning point in his long career of victory, Still certain of his genius, still confident in his good fortune, he looked forward to new conquests which would throw those of the past into the shade, and as his eyes rested on that mighty city of the Czars, the intoxication of glory filled his soul. The conqueror gave but little time to those dreams. The steps to realize them must be taken. Murat was bidden to march forward quickly and to repress all disorders which might break out in the city. Denier was ordered to hasten and arrange for the food and lodging of the soldiers. Duresnel received orders to communicate with the authorities, to calm their fears, and to lead them to the conqueror, that he might receive their homage. Fancying that the inhabitants awaited his coming in trembling fear, Napoleon halted until these preliminaries should be arranged, before making his triumphant entry into the conquered capital of Muscovy. Murat, at the head of the light cavalry, galloped rapidly forward, quickly reaching the bridge over the Moskova. Here he found a rear guard of the Russian army in rapid retreat. The meeting was not a hostile one. Murat rode to the Russian line and asked if there was an officer among them who spoke French. A young Russian immediately presented himself and asked him what he wanted. "Who is the commander of this rear guard?" he asked. The Russian pointed to a white-haired officer who wore a long cloak of fur. Murat advanced and held out his hand. The officer took and pressed it warmly. "Do you know me?" asked the Frenchman. "Yes," answered the Russian courteously. "We have seen enough of you under fire to know you." A short colloquy succeeded, during which Murat could not keep his eyes from the officer's fur cloak, which looked as if it would be very comfortable in a winter bivouac. The Russian, noticing his looks, took off the mantle and offered it to him, begging him to accept it as a present from an admiring foe. Murat courteously accepted it, and in return presented the officer with a beautiful and valuable watch, which was accepted in the same spirit of courteous goodwill. The Russian officer now joined his men, who were filing rapidly away, and Murat rode onward into the streets of the captured city, his staff and a detachment of cavalry accompanying him. Through street after street he passed, here finding himself moving between rows of narrow wooden houses, there through avenues bordered by palatial residences, which rose from rich and ample gardens, but all silent and seemingly deserted. The city was there, but where were the people? Solitude surrounded him. Not an inhabitant was to be seen. It seemed a city of the dead. Into Berlin, Vienna, and other capitals had the French army entered, but never had it seen anything like this utter solitude. The inhabitants, so the surprised soldiers fancied, must be cowering in terror within their houses. This desolation could not continue. Moscow was known as one of the most bustling cities in Europe. As soon as the people learned that no harm was meant them, the streets would again swarm with busy life. Hugging this flattering opinion to his soul, Murat rode on, threading the silent city. Ah, here were some of the people. A few distracted individuals had appeared in the streets. Murat rode up to them, to find that they were French, belonging to the foreign colony of Moscow. They begged piteously for protection from the robbers, who they said had become masters of the town. They told Murat more than this, destroying the pleasant picture of a submissive and contented population with which he had solaced his mind. The population had fled, they said. No one was left in the city except a few strangers and some Russians who knew the ways of the French and did not fear them. In their place was a crew of thieves and bandits, whom the Count of Rostopchín had let loose on deserted Moscow, emptying the prisons and setting these convicts free to ravage the city at their will. Further evidence of this disheartening story was soon forthcoming. When the French approached the Kremlin, they were saluted by a discharge of musketry. Some of the villainous crew had invaded the capital, seized on the guns in the arsenal, and were firing on the invaders. A few minutes settled this last effort in the defense of Moscow. The citadel was entered at a charge, several of the villainous crew were sabred, and the others put to flight. The French had the town, but it was an empty one, its only inmates being thieves and strangers. The next morning, September 15th, 1812, Napoleon made his triumphal march into Moscow at the head of his conquering legions, but for the first time in his career of victory he found himself in the streets of a deserted city, advancing through empty avenues, to whose windows the tread of marching feet called not an eye to witness the triumph of France. It was a gloomy and threatening impression which was experienced by the Grand Army in its progress through those silent and lifeless streets. The ancient city of the Czars seemed a body without a soul. But if the people were gone, their dwellings remained. Moscow was taken, with all its palaces and treasures. It was a signal conquest. Napoleon hastened to the Kremlin, mounted to the top of the lofty tower of Ivan, and from its height looked with eyes of pride on the far-extending city. It was grand, that vision of palatial mansions, but it was mournful in its silence and gloom. the tramp of soldiery its only sound, the flutter of multitudes of birds, ravens and crows, which haunted the city in thousands, its only sign of life. 2 days before, Moscow had been one of the busiest cities in the world. Now it was the most silent. But the conqueror had this satisfaction, that while abandoned, like other Russian towns, it was not burned like them. He might find here winter quarters for his army, and by mild measures lure the frightened people back to their homes again. Comforted with this hopeful view, Napoleon descended the stairs again, filled with confidence and triumph. His confidence was misplaced. Disaster lowered upon the devoted city. On the day succeeding his entrance, a column of flame suddenly appeared, rising from a large building, in which was stored an abundant supply of spirits. The soldiers ran thither without thought of alarm, fancying that this was due to some imprudence on the part of their own men. In a short time the fire was mastered, and a feeling of confidence returned. But immediately afterwards a new fire broke out in a great collection of buildings called the Bazaar, in which were the richest shops of the city, filled with costly goods, the beautiful fabrics of Persia and India, and rare and precious commodities from all quarters of the world. Here the flames spread with extraordinary rapidity, consuming the inflammable goods with frightful haste, despite the frantic efforts of the soldiers to arrest their progress. Despairing of success, they strove to save something from the vast riches of the establishment, carrying out furs, costly wines, valuable tissues, and other precious treasures. Such as remained of the people of the town aided in these efforts, in the natural desire to save something from the flames. Until now, all this seemed ordinary accident, and no one dreamed that these fires were the result of hostile design. They were soon to learn more of the unconquerable determination of the Russians. During the following night the wind rose suddenly and carried the flames of the burning bazaar along several of the most beautiful streets of Moscow, the fire spreading rapidly among the wooden buildings, and consuming them with alarming rapidity. But this was not the most disturbing indication. Rockets were seen in the distance, ascending into the air, and immediately afterwards fire broke out in a dozen quarters, and hired bandits were seen carrying combustibles at the end of long poles, and seeking to extend the empire of the flames. A number of these were arrested, and under threat of death revealed a frightful secret. The Count of Rostopchín had ordered that the great city of Moscow should be set on fire and burned, with as little heed for the immense loss involved as he would have had in ordering the burning of a wayside village. The news filled the whole army with consternation. Waiting till the wind had risen, the ferocious count had sent up his signal rockets to order the work to begin. He had done more. On running to the pumps to obtain water to extinguish the flames, there were none to be found. They had been removed, and the fire-extinguishing apparatus destroyed in preparation for this incendiary work. Napoleon, alarmed and incensed, ordered that all caught in the act of firing buildings should be executed on the spot. The army was directed to use every effort to extinguish the flames, but the high wind set all their efforts at defiance. It increased in fury and varied in direction, carrying the conflagration over new quarters. From the Kremlin could be seen vast columns of fire shooting from building to building, wrapping the wooden structures in lurid sheets of flame, sweeping destruction forward at frightful speed. The roar of the flames, the explosions that from time to time took place, the burning fragments which filled the air, borne on the wings of the wind, all went to make a scene as grand and fearful as human eye has ever gazed upon. To Napoleon and his men, who saw their hopes of safe and pleasant winter quarters thus vanishing in flame, it must have been a most alarming and disquieting spectacle. After blowing for some hours from the northwest, the wind shifted to the southwest, and the conflagration invaded new regions of the city. The Kremlin, hitherto out of the range of the flames, was now in danger. Fiery sparks, borne by the wind, fell on its roof and in its courtyard. The most frightful danger of the whole night now threatened the imperiled army. In the courtyards of the Kremlin had been placed more than 400 wagons of ammunition. In its arsenal were 100,000 pounds of powder. Should the flames reach these, Napoleon and his guards would be blown into the air. All who were near him pressed him to hasten from this imminent peril. General Lariboisière begged them to fly, as a duty which he owed to his army. Officers who came in from the streets reported that it was almost impossible to pass through the avenues of the town, and that delay would increase the danger. To remain where they were much longer might render escape impossible. Napoleon, convinced by these words, left the Kremlin, after some 24 hours' possession of this old palace of the Czars, and descended to the quay of the Moskva, where he found his horses awaiting him. Mounting, he rode through the fire-invaded streets towards the northwest, but with no little difficulty and danger, for the flames from the other quarters of the city were now spreading here. The wind seemed steadily to increase in violence. Torrents of smoke, cinders, and sparks were driven down into the streets. Sheets of flame seemed to bend downward, as if to sweep the ground. On every side the troops were flying for their lives. On every side the conflagration pursued them. It was through imminent peril that the grand army, which on the morning before had marched so triumphantly into that abandoned city, now succeeded in gaining a safe location outside, whence they could look back in despair on that hell of flames in which their dearest hopes were being consumed. A small number of the inhabitants who had remained concealed in their houses now came out, carrying away with them what treasures they most esteemed. In some cases, women their children, men their aged parents, many of them barely saving their clothes, and disputing the possession of even these with the band of robbers whom Rostopchín had let loose, and who, like spirits of evil, danced with glee in the midst of the terrible conflagration which had been kindled by their hands. So ended one of the most startling events in history, the burning of a great city to dispossess a victorious foe. It proved successful. When Napoleon left the Kremlin on that fearful night, he began his downward career. The conflagration, it is true, did not drive him at once from Moscow. He lingered for more than a month amid its ruins, in the vain hope that the Tsar would ask him for terms of peace. But the Tsar kept silent. The city was untenable for winter quarters, and retreat became imperative. When at length the grand army marched, winter marched with it, a winter such as even Russia had rarely seen. Napoleon had delayed too long. The North gathered its forces and swooped upon its shivering ranks, with death in its blasts. The Russians, recovering from their losses, rushed upon his freezing columns, pouring destruction upon them as they marched. All was at an end. The great victor's tide of success had definitely turned. He had entered Russia with nearly 500,000 men. Hardly a tenth part of this great army followed him from that fatal land. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. Napoleon's Return from Elba. All was quiet in Elba. Nothing was talked of at Porto Ferrajo but the ball to be given by Pauline, the sister of Napoleon, who had exchanged his imperial dominion over half Europe for kingship over that little Mediterranean island. Evening came. The fête was a brilliant one. Napoleon was present, gay, cheerful, easy, to all appearance fully satisfied with his little kingdom, and without thought of wider empire or heavier cares. He stayed till a late hour, and went home with two of his old generals, Bertrand and Drouet, to tell them the news which had come to him from the Continent. The news was not altogether to his liking. The Congress at Vienna had decreed his transportation to the Azores. Elba was too near France. Such was the state of affairs on the night of February 25th, 1815. At sunset of the next day there might have been seen a small flotilla moving before a south wind along the shores of Elba. It consisted of a brig, the Inconstant by name, a schooner, and 5 smaller vessels. The brig evidently carried guns. The decks of the other vessels were crowded with men in uniform. On the deck of the Inconstant stood Napoleon, his face filled with hope and joy, his hand waving an adieu to his sister Pauline, who watched him from the chateau windows on the island shore. The next day came. The sea was motionless. Not a breath of wind could be felt. The island was still close at hand. At a distance might be seen the French and English cruisers which guarded that side of the island, now moveless upon a moveless sea. It was doubtful if the flotilla had not better return, but the wind rose again, and their progress was resumed. 4 in the afternoon found them off the heights of Leghorn. 5 leagues to leeward lay one frigate, near the shores of Corsica was another. To windward could be seen a third, making its way towards the flotilla. It was the Zephyr of the French navy, commanded by Captain Andrieux. Now had come a vital moment in the enterprise. Should the Emperor declare himself, and seek to gain over Andrieux? It was too dangerous a venture. He bade the grenadiers on the deck to conceal themselves. It was a situation in which strategy seemed better than boldness. At 6 the two vessels were close together. Lieutenant Taillade of the Inconstant knew and saluted Captain Andrieux. A speaking trumpet colloquy followed. "Where are you bound?" asked Taillade. "To Leghorn. And you?" "To Genoa. Have you any commissions I can execute there?" "Thanks, not any. How is the Emperor?" "Very well. So much the better." The two vessels moved on, and soon lost sight of each other in the growing darkness. The other frigates had disappeared. The next day dawned. There was visible a large frigate in the distance, but it was not moving towards the flotilla. No danger was to be feared from this source. But the vessel's head had been turned to the southward, to Tayad's surprise. "Gentlemen," he called to the officers on the bridge, "are we bound for Spain or for Africa?" Napoleon, who had perceived the same thing, summoned Tayad from his conference with the officers. "Where are we?" he asked. "Sire, we are headed for Africa." "I don't wish to go there. Take me to France." "Your Majesty shall be there before noon tomorrow." The face of Napoleon beamed on hearing these words. He turned to the soldiers of the Old Guard who accompanied him, and said, "Yes, grenadiers, we are going to France, to Paris." Enthusiastic vivas followed his announcement, which told a tale of future glory to those war-hardened veterans. They had fought for the Emperor on many a mighty field. They were ready to dare new dangers in the hope of new triumphs. On the morning of Wednesday, March 1st, the shores of France were visible from the vessel's deck. At 3 in the afternoon anchor was dropped in the Bay of Juan. Cheers and salvos of artillery greeted those welcome shores, the boats were quickly dropped, and by 5 o'clock the whole expedition was on shore. The soldiers made their bivouac in an olive grove on the borders of the bay. "Happy omens," said Napoleon. "The olive is the emblem of peace." He plucked some violets, and then sat down and consulted his maps, which were spread on a table before him. There were two routes which might be taken, an easy one through Provence, and a difficult one over the snowy mountains of Dauphiny. But on the former he could not count on the loyalty of the people, on the latter he could. The difficult route was chosen. It proved a cold and wearying journey. The men were obliged to march in single file along narrow roads which bordered precipices. Several mules, one of them laden with gold, lost their footing and were plunged down the cliff. Napoleon was forced to dismount and go on foot to keep warm. For a short time he rested beside the brushwood fire of a cabin whose only tenant was an old woman. "Have you any news from Paris?" he asked her. "Do you know what the king is doing?" "The king? You mean the Emperor," answered the old woman. "He is always down yonder." So here was a Frenchwoman who had not heard a word of the last year's doings. Was this the stuff of glory? Napoleon looked at General Drouet, and said in pensive tones, "Do you hear this, Drouet? What, after all, is the good of troubling the world in order to fill it with our name?" We cannot follow their progress step by step. That small army of 1,000 men was marching to conquer a kingdom, but for days it had only the mountains and the snows to overcome. As yet not a soldier had been encountered, and they had been a week on shore. But the news of the landing had now spread far and wide, and soldiers were marching to stop the advance of the Brigand of Elba, as the royalists in Paris called Napoleon. How would they receive him, with volleys or acclamations? That was soon to be learned. The troops in that part of France were concentrated at Grenoble and its vicinity. The Emperor was approaching them. The problem would soon be solved. At 9 o'clock of March 7th, Napoleon separated his small force into 3 divisions, himself taking station in the midst of the advance guard on horseback, wearing his famous grey overcoat and the broad ribbon of the Legion of Honour. About 1 o'clock the small battalion approached a regiment of the troops of the king, who were drawn up in a line across the road. Napoleon dismounted. "Colonel Maillet," he said, "tell the soldiers to put their weapons under their left arms, points down." "Sire," said the colonel, "is it not dangerous to act thus in presence of troops whose sentiments we do not know, and whose first fire may be so fatal?" "Maillet, tell them to put the weapons under their arms," repeated Napoleon. The order was obeyed. The 2 battalions faced each other, at short pistol shot, in absolute silence. Napoleon advanced alone towards the royal troops. "Present arms," he commanded. They obeyed, levelling their guns at their old commander. He advanced slowly with impassive face. Reaching their front, he touched his cap and saluted. "Soldiers of the 5th," he cried loudly, "do you recognize me?" "Yes, yes," came from some voices, filled with barely repressed enthusiasm. "Soldiers, behold your general, behold your emperor," he continued. "Let any of you who wishes to kill him, fire." Fire? Their guns went to the earth. They flung themselves on their knees before him, called him father, shed tears, shouted as if in frenzy, waved their shakos on their bayonets and sabres. "All is over," said Napoleon to Bertrand and Drouet. "In 10 days we shall be in the Tuileries." In a brief time the Emperor moved on, the king's regiment, now wearing the tricolour cockade, following with his former troop. As they drew near Grenoble, throngs of peasantry gathered with enthusiastic cheers. Another regiment approached, the 7th of the line, commanded by Colonel de Labédoyère. He had taken the eagle of the regiment from a chest, brandished his sword, and crying, "Long live the Emperor! Those who love, follow me!" led the way from Grenoble. The whole regiment followed. Meeting Napoleon, the colonel and the Emperor sprang from their horses and warmly embraced. "Colonel," said Napoleon, "it is you who will replace me on the throne." It was night when they reached Grenoble. The Royalist authorities had closed the gates, but the ramparts were thronged with men. The darkness was profound, but Labédoyère called out loudly, "Soldiers, it is I, Labédoyère, colonel of the 7th. We bring you Napoleon. He is yonder. It is for you to receive him, and to repeat with us the rallying cry of the former conquerors of Europe, 'Live the Emperor!'" His words were followed by a ringing shout from the ramparts. Many ran to the gates. Finding them closed and barred, they furiously attacked them with axes, while the peasants outside hammered on them as fiercely. Thus doubly assailed, they soon gave way, and the stream of newcomers rushed in, torches and flambeaux illuminating the scene. Napoleon had no little difficulty in making his way through the crowd, which was delirious with joy, and reaching an inn, the Three Dauphins, where he designed to pass the night. On the 9th he left Grenoble, followed by 6,000 of his old soldiers. His march was an ovation. He reached Lyons on the 10th. Several regiments had been collected here to oppose him, but they all trampled the white cockade of the king under foot, assumed the tricolour, and fraternized with the Emperor's troops. Marshal Ney was the only hope left to the Royalists. He had, they said, promised Louis XVIII. To bring back Napoleon in an iron cage. This hope vanished when Ney issued a proclamation beginning, "The cause of the Bourbons is lost for ever," which was followed on March 18th by his embracing the Emperor openly at Auxerre. All was over for Louis XVIII. Near midnight of March 19th, some travelling carriages rolled away from the courtyard of the Tuileries in a torrent of rain, and amid a furious windstorm that extinguished the carriage lights. It was Louis XVIII. Going into exile. On the 20th, at 9 o'clock in the evening, the Emperor Napoleon drove through the streets of Paris towards the abandoned palace, through hosts of shouting soldiers and a population that was wild with joy. The officers tore him from his carriage and carried him on their arms, kissing his hands, embracing his old grey overcoat, not letting his feet touch ground till they had borne him to the foot of the grand stairway of the Tuileries. It was 20 days since he had landed, and France was his, the people, the soldiers alike, mad with delight, none, to all appearance, dreaming of what renewed miseries this ill-omened return of their worshipped emperor meant. It meant, as we now know, bloodshed, slaughter, and ruin. It meant Waterloo and St. Helena. It meant 100 days of renewed empire, and then the final end of the power of the great conqueror. On August 7th, less than 5 months from the date of the triumphant entry into the Tuileries, Napoleon stepped on board the British frigate Northumberland, to be borne to the far-off isle of St. Helena, his future home. 25 years after the date of these events, Napoleon returned again to France, but under very different auspices from those described. On the 29th of November, 1840, there anchored at Cherbourg, amid the salutes of forts and ships, a French war vessel called the Belle Poule, on which were the mortal remains of the great conqueror, long since conquered by death, and now brought back to the land over which he had so long reigned. On December 8th, the coffin was transferred to the steamer Normandie, amid a salute of 2,000 guns, and taken by it to the Seine. On December 15th, the coffin, placed on a splendid car drawn by 16 horses, moved in solemn procession through the streets of Paris, attended by the noblest escort the city could provide, and passing through avenues thronged with adoring multitudes, who forgot the injuries the great soldier had done to France, and remembered only his fame. The funeral train was received by King Louis Philippe, the royal family, and all the high dignitaries of the government at the church of the Invalides, in which a noble and worthy final resting place had been prepared for the corpse of the once mighty emperor. Napoleon, says Bourrienne, had again and finally conquered. While every throne in Europe was shaking, the great conqueror came to claim and receive from posterity the crown for which he had sacrificed so much. In the Invalides the emperor had at last found a resting place by the banks of the Seine among the French people whom he had loved so well. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32, The Prussian War and the Paris Commune. There have been two critical periods in the story of France in which history was made at a rate of rapidity rarely equalled in the history of the world. The first of these was the era of the Revolution and the Napoleonic regime, which has no parallel among human events in the rapidity and momentous gravity of its changes. The second was the period from August 1870 to the summer of 1871, less than a year in length, yet crowded with important events to an unprecedented degree. Within that year was fought a great war between France and Germany, in which the military power of France, in an incredibly brief period, was utterly overthrown, and that nation left at the mercy of its opponent. Within the same period the Second Empire of France came to a sudden and disastrous end, and a republic, the third in French history, was built upon its ruins. Simultaneously a new and powerful empire was founded, that of Germany, the palace at Versailles being the scene of this highly important change in the political conditions of Europe. During this period also a political revolution took place in Italy, in consequence of the French war, and Paris sustained two sieges, the first by the German army, the second, and most bitter, by the French themselves, fighting against a mob of fanatical revolutionists, and ending in a frightful saturnalia of murder, ruin, and revenge. Has there ever been a year in the world's history more crowded with momentous events? Within that year the political status of France, Germany, and Italy was transformed. The late Emperor of France suddenly found himself a throneless fugitive, and the people of Paris passed through an experience unparalleled in the diversified history of that ancient city. Of all the sieges to which Paris had been subjected, far the strangest was that in which the scum of the city, miscalled the Commune, fought with tiger-like ferocity against the forces of the newly formed republic, filled with the revengeful and murderous spirit which had inspired the masses in the first revolution. It is the story of this tragic interlude which we propose here to tell, premising with a brief resume of the events which led up to it. Louis Napoleon, posing as Emperor Napoleon III of France, a position which he had been able to gain through the glamour of the name of his famous uncle, was infected through his reign with the desire to emulate the deeds of the great Napoleon. He hoped to shine as one of the military stars of Europe, and was encouraged by the success of the war which he fomented in Italy. His second effort in this direction was the invasion of Mexico and the attempt to establish an empire under his tutelage upon American soil. In this he ran counter to the Monroe Doctrine and the power of the United States, and was forced to retire with his feathers scorched and his prestige sadly diminished. But what he probably proposed to make the great military triumph of his reign came in 1870, when, on a flimsy pretense, a misunderstanding which called only for diplomatic adjustment, he suddenly declared war against Germany, and rashly put his armies into the field to cope with that powerful rival. Never had there been a more unwise or suicidal proceeding. In shameful ignorance of the real condition of the army, which he was made to believe was 5 times ready, ready to the last gaiter button, he marshalled against the thoroughly prepared military power of Germany an army ill organized, ill supplied, without proper reserves, and led by commanders of appalling incapacity. Maps and plans were bad, strategy was an unknown quantity, no study had been made of the use of the railway in war, almost everything except courage was lacking. And courage without leadership was hopeless against the thoroughly drilled and supplied German army and the science of John Moltke, the great German strategist. Had it been the first Napoleon, he would have made himself sure personally as to the last gaiter button and all other details. But with sublime self-satisfaction and inane blindness, the second Napoleon put himself at the head of this unready army, inspired apparently with the "on to Berlin" confidence of the cheering Parisian mob. He was to be awakened suddenly and painfully from his dream of victory and military fame. The first collision of the two armies took place on August 2nd. On September 2nd, just 1 month later, the derelict emperor was a prisoner of war in the hands of the King of Prussia, together with his army of more than 80,000 men. He had proved an utter failure as a commander, a mere encumbrance, without a plan of campaign, a conception of leadership, or an idea of strategic movements. Recognizing when too late his incapacity, he had resigned the general command to Marshal Bazaine, who withdrew with a large army into Metz, and subsequently, in a northward movement for Bazaine's relief, he found himself surrounded at Sedan by an irresistible force, and was obliged to surrender to save his army from impending annihilation. Such was the first act in this lugubrious drama. 2 days later, on September 4th, France was proclaimed a republic. Before the end of October Bazaine surrendered Metz to the Germans, and his great army of 180,000 men was lost to France. The military force of France was vanishing with alarming rapidity. Another event of the period, of interest in this connection, was the loss of the temporal power of the Pope, above alluded to. The papacy had been defended by Napoleon III against the Italian revolutionists, and the withdrawal of the French force from Rome left that city open to the army of Victor Emmanuel. It was occupied in September, and became the capital of the new kingdom of Italy. In December another important event took place, the King of Prussia being proclaimed at Versailles the head of a new empire of Germany, which embraced all the German states except Austria. Events of great moment, as may be seen, were occurring with startling rapidity. Before the surrender of Bazaine, the advance of the German army had appeared before Paris, and on September 19th the siege of that city began. Soon it was so closely invested that food could not enter, and the only way out was by balloon. The German bombardment did little damage to the great city, which was defended obstinately, but the Germans had a powerful ally within, where the grisly demon of famine threatened the defenders. Meanwhile, Gambetta, the most ardent patriot left to France, was seeking with nervous energy to raise fresh armies in the south. Garibaldi, his sword free from duty in Italy, had come to the aid of France. All patriots were called to the ranks, and a struggle of some importance took place. But all this practically ceased on the 28th of January, 1871, when an armistice brought the hopeless resistance of Paris to an end. Almost at once the war died out on all sides. The Germans occupied all the forts around Paris, and France lay at the mercy of Germany after a struggle of 6 months' duration. The first siege of Paris had terminated. A second and more desperately contested one was at hand. On March 13th the German army surrounded Paris, which had been given the triumph of a march into the conquered city, set out on its return home, and the authorities of the new republic prepared to take possession of their freed capital. They were to find the task one of unlooked-for difficulty. On March 18th the revolutionary element of the city rose en masse, organized under the name of the Commune, took possession of Paris, and prepared to defend it to the death against the leaders of the new-formed government, who they condemned as aristocrats. The story of the Commune is a shameful and terrible one. Being in a fraternization of the National Guard with the mob, its advent was sealed with murder. In a contest on the 18th for the possession of some cannon, General Lecomte ordered his men to fire on the insurgents. They refused. A gentleman standing in a crowd of angry men on the street corner said, "General Lecomte is right." He was immediately seized and quickly recognized as General Clément Thomas, a brave officer who had done gallant service during the siege. This sufficed him nothing with the mob. He and General Lecomte were at once dragged away to prison. At 4 o'clock that same day they were brought out by a party of the insurgent National Guards, and after a mock trial were taken to a walled enclosure and shot down in cold blood. They were the first victims of the mob, which had early begun to burn its bridges behind it. On the following day the leaders of the outbreak met at the Hôtel de Ville. They all belonged to the Internationale, a secret society formed for the abolition of property, religion, rulers, government, and the upper classes, and the reduction of the community to a state of anarchy, or something resembling it. They called upon the citizens to meet in their sections and elect a commune, the new form of government advocated by the anarchists, in which destruction of all existing institutions was to precede reconstruction from the bottom upwards. Events now moved rapidly. A delegation from the few men of note left in Paris proceeded to Versailles, where the government of the Republic was in session, and demanded that special municipal rights should be given to the people of Paris. The refusal of this request precipitated the insurrection. The furious people at once elected a revolutionary government, choosing the most extreme of the revolutionists, who organized what was called the Council of the Commune. This consisted of 80 members of varied nationality, 70 of them never having been heard of in Paris before. They had risen from the bottom of the deep sea of anarchy to assume control. On the 3rd of April the civil war broke out. Paris against Versailles, the army under the Assembly of the Republic against the National Guard in sympathy with the Commune. The Germans, who still held 2 of the forts in the vicinity of Paris, looked grimly on at the tragedy about to be played upon the stage which their hands had erected. The war began with murder. Dr. Pasquier, a distinguished surgeon, bearing a flag of truce, met 2 National Guards on the bridge of Courbevoie, near Neuilly, where the body of Napoleon had been brought ashore 30 years before. After a brief debate, one of the soldiers ended the colloquy by blowing out the doctor's brains. As soon as General Vinoy, in command of the army of order, heard of this murderous act, he ordered the guns of Fort Varelien to be turned upon the city. On the following morning 5 columns of the troops of the Commune marched out to take the fort, lured by the confident impression that the soldiers under Vinoy would fraternize with them. They were mistaken. The guns of Fort Varelien hurled death-dealing missiles into their columns, and they were quickly in full retreat. Fleurance, a scientist of fame who had joined their ranks, fell dead. Duval, one of their generals, was captured and was quickly shot as a traitor. The other leaders were at once sent to prison by the angry council on their return, and the Commune ordered that Paris should be filled with barricades. Though the Commune had imprisoned the unsuccessful generals, they were infuriated at the execution of Generals Duval, and sought in the dignitaries of the Church the most exalted hostages they could find against such summary acts. On the night of the 6th, Monseigneur d'Arbois, Archbishop of Paris, his chaplain, and 8 other priests were arrested. The curé of the Madeleine and his vicar had before been seized. Other priests were later taken into custody, and the prison at Mazas was well filled with these so-called hostages. The fury of the leaders of the revolt led them to other excesses against religion, the churches being closed, the arms cut from the crosses, and red flags hung in their stead. The outrages were not confined to the church. In the words of a resident of Paris, the motto of the Commune soon became fraternity of that sort which means arrest of each other. Before the council was 2 weeks old, many of its leading members had found their way to prison. Dissensions had broken out in its midst, and the stronger victimized the weaker. By April 7th, a personage calling himself General Cluseret had, as someone expressed it, swallowed up the Commune. He called himself an American, and had been in the Union service in the American Civil War, but no one knew where he was born. He had served in the Chasseurs d'Afrique and in the Papal Zouaves, and after the fall of the Commune escaped from Paris and became a general of the Fenians, nearly capturing Chester Castle in their service. This man became absolute dictator over the revolted city with its 2 million of inhabitants. Yet, after 3 weeks of this dictatorial rule, his star declined, and he found himself in prison at Mazas, to which he had sent so many others. Leaving these details for the present, we must return to the war, which was soon in full blast. The assault of April 4th repulsed, the guns of Fort Varelien were opened upon the city, and the second bombardment of Paris in that memorable year began. The guns of its friends were more destructive than those of its foes, the forts taking part in the bombardment being much nearer the centre of the city. Their shells damaged the Arch of Triumph, which the Prussians had spared. They fell alike on homes, public buildings, and churches, alike on men, women, and children, friend and foe. Under order of General Cluseret, the dictator of the Commune, every man was ordered to take part in the defense of the city. His neighbors were required to see that he did so, and to arrest him if he showed a disposition to decline. For the 73 days that the power of the Commune lasted, Paris was a veritable pandemonium, the fighting, the arrests, the bombardment keeping the excitement at an intense pitch. The people deserted the streets, which were silent and empty except for the soldiers of the Commune, a disorderly crew in motley uniforms, the movement of ammunition wagons, and the other scenes incident to a state of war. But the usual swarming life of Paris had vanished. There was no movement, scarcely any sound. The shop windows were shut, many of them boarded up, red flags hanging from a few, but as a rule the very buildings seemed dead. This is the story told by one observer, but another, perhaps at a different period of bombardment, speaks of well-dressed people loitering in the boulevards as if nothing were going on. The cafes, indeed, were ordered to close their doors at midnight, but behind closed shutters went on gambling, drinking, and debauchery. After spending a riotous night, fast men and women considered it a joke to drive out to the Arch of Triumph and see how the fight was going on. On the 9th of April, the army of Versailles began to make active assaults upon the forts held by the soldiers of the Commune, and with such effect that confusion and dismay quickly pervaded its councils. As the struggle went on, the fury and spirit of retaliation of the insurgents increased. New hostages were arrested, the palace of the Archbishop was pillaged, and in the first week of May the destruction of the house of M. Thiers, the President of the Republic, was decreed. It was a beautiful mansion, filled with objects of art and valuable documents used by him in writing his historical works. Some of these were removed, but most of them were consumed by the flames. On the 12th of May the Commune, now inspired by the spirit of destruction, ordered the levelling of the famous column in the Place Vendôme, describing it as a symbol of brute force and false glory. This famous column, 135 feet high, formed on the model of Trajan's column at Rome, had been erected by Napoleon I, cast from cannon taken from his foes, and surmounted by a statue of Napoleon in his imperial robes. On May 16th this proud work of art fell, being pulled down with a tremendous crash by the aid of ropes fastened to its upper part. It is pleasant to be able to state that this fine work of art has been restored. Its attempted destruction filled the army of Versailles with a spirit of revenge, which led them, on their entering Paris a few days later, to deal with the insurrectionists with brutal and merciless energy. They had other and abundant cause for this feeling, as the reader will perceive in the recital of the later deeds of the desperate Commune. By the date now reached, the army of order was rapidly gaining ground. The fort of Vauves was taken, that of Montrouge was dismantled, breaches were opening in the barricades, and by the 20th of May the army was in the streets and fighting its way onward against a desperate defense. The carnage was frightful. Dembrovski, a Pole and the only able general of the Commune, was killed. Prisoners on both sides were shot down without mercy. There were barricades in almost every street, and these were hotly defended, the courage of despair in their defenders making the progress of the besieging army a slow and bloody one. The rest of the story is all blood and horror. The desperate leaders of the Commune determined that if they must perish, Paris should be their funeral pyre. On the night of May 24th, the city became a scene of incendiary rage. The Hôtel de Ville was in flames, the palace of the Tuileries was burning like a great furnace, the palace of the Legion of Honor, the Ministry of War, the Treasury, were lurid volcanoes of flames. On all sides the torch had been applied. Not only these great public buildings, but many private houses were consigned to flames. All the sewers beneath Paris had been strewn with torpedoes, bombs, and inflammable materials, connected with electric wires, and the catacombs in the eastern quarter of the city were similarly prepared. It was the intention of the desperate revolutionists to blow up the city, but fortunately, before their preparations were completed, the army of order was in control, and sappers and miners were sent underground to cut the electric wires leading to those mines of death-dealing explosives. But the capture of the city came too late to save the lives of many of the hostages whom the Commune had sent to prison. Not content with burning the architectural monuments of the city, as the last effort of baffled rage they condemned these innocent victims of their wrath to death. On Wednesday, May 24th, the venerable archbishop and 5 others of the imprisoned priests were taken from their cells and shot to death. On Thursday 50 more, priests and others, were similarly slaughtered. A large number of captives remained shut up in the prison of La Roquette, around which, on Saturday the 27th, a yelling crowd gathered, thirsting for their lives. They, knowing that their rescuers were fighting within the city, determined to defend themselves and convert the prison into a fortress. Poiret, one of the warders, horrified by what had already been done, was the leader in the resolution, in which he was joined by the Abbé Lamazan, who called out, "Don't let us be shot, my friends. Let us defend ourselves. Trust in God, he is on our side." The sergents de ville, captives in the story below, had made the same resolution. They had no arms, but they barricaded the doors, and resolved to defend themselves from the murderous throng outside, howling for their blood. 2 guns and a mortar had been brought by the mob to fire on the prison, and the moment was critical. Suddenly there came a lull in the uproar. Something had taken place. In a few minutes more the crowd broke up and dispersed, dragging away the guns they had brought. Word had reached them that the council had fled from its headquarters to Belleville, and a sudden panic seized the mob. Yet that night they returned, howling and cursing, while a barricade near by was still held by the insurgents. But with the early dawn this was abandoned, the mob melted away, and soon after a battalion of rescuers marched up and took possession of the prison. The captives were saved. Their resistance, seemingly so desperate, had proved successful. That day, Sunday, May 28th, ended the rule of the Commune. The Versailles troops, who had been fighting their way steadily from street to street since the 21st, completed their work. The whole great city was in their hands, and the rule of the Commune was over. The Commune had left devastation behind it. On every side were smouldering ruins, including the great municipal buildings, the law courts, and other public edifices, 2 theatres, 8 whole streets, and innumerable private houses, while the dead bodies of its victims lay where they had been shot down. The soldiers, infuriated by the ruin which they beheld on all sides, were savage in their revenge. Every man seized whose hands were black with powder was instantly shot, many innocent persons perishing, since numbers had been forced to the barricades. The story of what took place during those bloody days of retribution is too long to tell, and it must suffice to sum it up in the frightful death roll of 14,000 persons, 6,000 of them killed in open fight, 8,000 executed in bitter revenge. The executions over, the prisons were filled to bursting. Count Orsi tells us that 600 men were locked up in the wine cellars of Versailles, 45 feet underground. He himself, falsely seized through the malice of an enemy, spent 10 days in this horrible place amid the scum of the insurgents. As for the members of the Council of the Commune, some escaped, some were executed, others were transported to New Caledonia, a lonely isle in the far Pacific, from which they were subsequently freed when the hot blood of that year of revengeful retribution cooled down. Thus ends the remarkable story of that year of war, insurrection, and devastation, the whole due to the overweening ambition of one man, Louis Napoleon, who wished to shine as a great conqueror. The destiny of France lay in his hand alone. He blindly decided upon war. The result was the humiliation of France, the death of thousands of her sons, the overthrow of her government, the frightful saturnalia of the rule of the Commune, and the loss to France of 2 of her provinces, those of Alsace and Lorraine, and a war indemnity of $1,000,000,000. Such terrors march in the train of blind and unrestrained ambition. The End. End of Chapter 32. End of Historical Tales, Volume 6, French, by Charles Morris.